They said the Red Wedding would be the end of him. Men with a keen sense for prophecy and fools alike swore no one walked away from Walder Frey's hospitality when he'd grown weary of them. Yet in the candle-lit halls of the twins, where the smell of roasted meats mingled with that of fresh spilled blood and sour wine, the young wolf did the impossible. He survived. They tried to slit his throat. They tried to stick him full of crossbow bolts. They tried to hack him apart as if he were an inconvenient piece of rotten meat. But Catelyn Stark's shrieking distraction, a sudden shift of loyalty from some who'd followed Roose Bolton, the swirl of chaos, whatever small measure of the old gods' favor that lingered, gave Robb Stark the moment he needed. The fraction of a moment to duck, to roll under a table, to grab the dagger from a limp hand of a now-dead ally. The hall was a butcher's yard, red rivulets spattering across new boots and worn stone. The screech of steel echoed off the walls, overshadowed by the frantic screams of the minstrels who, but moments before, had been playing a merry wedding tune. Robb had come to the twins for a wedding that was to seal loyalty, his uncle Edmure to Rosalind Frey, and instead found betrayal. Yet all the cunning Walder Frey had mustered could not fully quell the Northman's fury. Robb was on his feet, fearsome and alive. He had once been called the Young Wolf for his skill and cunning in war, and more than that for a certain sense that something of a wolf's nature lived behind his cool gray eyes. Now, in the middle of that treacherous feast, he discovered exactly how feral he could be when cornered. He took a crossbow bolt to the side, the impact nearly spinning him off his feet, pain flaring hot and fierce. But he plunged forward, dagger in hand, and sank the blade into the neck of the nearest Frey, a sneering man whose face turned into shock as he gargled on his own blood. All around them, Stark men, small in number, scrambled to rally. Many had fallen victim to the initial volley of bolts from the gallery above. The Freys had struck just as the last toast to the bride rang out. Robb saw men he'd known since boyhood collapse before he could even shout a warning. But the few that were left alive had rallied to him now. Catelyn Stark, shrieking for mercy at first, found none. She saw her son injured. She heard the mocking laughter of Walder Frey from his dais, though the old man soon stopped laughing when 3 Stark soldiers rushed him. Edmure Tully had been seized by Frey men, and no sign of him was visible in the chaos, only that he was likely dragged deeper into the castle. The Greatjon had taken a blow to the head early on but was swinging a table leg in a blood-mad fury before Frey's spearmen stabbed him through. The entire hall was a confusion of steel, bodies, and howling. Catelyn reached Robb's side before Roose Bolton could. She clung to him for a moment as he clutched his side, but there was no time for a mother's comfort. The Freys were pushing around them, forming an iron ring. Robb, dazed and losing blood, forced himself to remain upright. "Go!" he roared, his voice crackling with pain. "Mother, run!" He had no illusions that he was safer if she was by his side. At that moment, the only chance they had was to break through and find some manner of refuge or advantage. Catelyn would not leave him, not willingly, but he could hardly shield her if they were both pinned by spears. His mother would not run, though. She pressed a hand against his wounded side, applying whatever pressure she could. All around, crossbowmen in the gallery reloaded. Walder Frey was snarling furious commands, though the old man's voice was lost in the din. Crossbow bolts kept streaking overhead, lodging in the wooden beams and in the backs of men on both sides. Some Freys fell to friendly fire as the angles grew tight. But the trap was still near perfect. Even if Robb could fight off a few men, there was no straightforward path to freedom. The old man's idea had been to box them in, to kill them as easy as cornered rabbits in a snare. And then, by pure fortune or intervention of the old gods, Black Walder Frey, one of the more vicious among Walder's brood, caught sight of a lurking shape on the edges of the hall. In the confusion, Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, had managed to break free of the small pen outside where he'd been caged. The direwolf's presence was sudden, savage, a gray streak in the torchlight. Men started screaming as Grey Wind tore through them, his jaws clamping down on throats, on arms, on faces. For the moment it took to reload a crossbow, the tide shifted. Robb lurched forward, using that wave of panic to fell another Frey. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the raging pain in his side, the hot wetness soaking into his tunic. He was aware of Catelyn still at his side. He was aware of the last handful of Northmen behind him, hacking, roaring, half-crazed with the betrayal. One of them was Smaljin Umber, but Robb didn't have a chance to confirm if it was indeed the Great John's son, or only a fleeting glimpse of a bearded face. He knew they couldn't survive much longer in that hall. Grey Wind's rampage pushed enough of the Freys aside that Robb and his mother, along with a few loyal men, managed to surge for the exit. Roose Bolton, who had whispered in Robb's ear that he sent his regards before he tried to stab him in the heart, cursed them from behind. Bolts followed them. Some men fell to that hail, but Robb staggered onward, refusing to collapse. He flung open the doors of the hall, stumbling into the courtyard of the twins, slick stones beneath his boots. More Frey soldiers awaited them there. He didn't know how he survived in the following moments. The pain was so intense that time blurred, twisting into a nightmarish swirl of shouts, clashing blades, lightning flashes of steel under the torches. He vaguely remembered slashing at a man's face, glimpsing a tuft of gray-brown hair, and the startled eyes of a Frey cousin. He remembered Grey Wind bounding past, muzzle dripping red, and then a horse screaming somewhere behind them. The next clear memory was crossing the drawbridge, broken chains and battered wood. Freys tried to swing the gate shut, but the Stark men battered it open. A horse, riderless, sprinted panicked through the opening and was cut down by a storm of crossbow bolts from the ramparts. But in that momentary confusion, Robb and a handful of survivors pushed past. They vaulted over the wrecked timbers, seeking anything resembling a path. And in a stroke of madness, or destiny, the direwolf and the men he carried with him broke free into the darkness of the night. At some point, after they were out of arrow range, he sagged from blood loss. Catelyn was screaming for a maester. One of the loyal men, perhaps Smaljin Umber, though Robb could hardly see through his dimming vision, caught him in strong arms. They fled, the direwolf leading them away from the twins, away from the scene of treachery. All that remained behind them was the horrifying knowledge that many of their company were dead or captured, that Walder Frey would be thirsting for revenge, and that Roose Bolton had revealed his betrayal. But the young wolf was alive, and there was no forgetting that. Days later, in a small village hidden in a tangle of hills, Robb woke to the sound of crackling fire and the smell of boiled nettle broth. His side felt as if it had been ripped open and haphazardly stitched together with twine. Every breath was a trial. Beside him sat Catelyn, her face streaked with dried tears, looking older than he'd ever seen her. She caught his hand as soon as she saw him stir. She whispered words of relief and pressed her lips to his forehead. He stared at her, mutely at first, then rasped the question he dreaded, the only one that truly mattered. Who made it out? He found out that his uncle Edmure had been taken as a hostage, or worse, though Rosalind Frey might have had some pity. The Greyjohn was dead, some believed, and most of the northern lords who had accompanied Robb were either slain or taken. But by some stroke of fortune, Smaljin Umber, Sir Wendell Manderly, and a handful of other bannermen had escaped alongside him. They'd carried Robb here to a half-ruined holdfast where a maester loyal to the Tullys had done what he could to heal the wound in his side. Grey Wind prowled near the door, watchful, as though any moment a band of Freys might crash through to finish what had been started. Over the next few days, while Robb regained some strength and fought off infection, the remnants of his small host trickled in. They brought dire news. Walder Frey's betrayal was widely known. The North had lost its lords in one fell swoop. The traitorous Boltons were consolidating power at the Dreadfort, and the Lannisters were crowing that the war was all but won. Tywin Lannister had banked on the Freys and the Boltons to crush the Stark cause. The miracle that Robb had escaped was a secret that could not remain hidden for long. Catelyn's heart was heavy with grief for the slaughter. She wore that grief plainly in the hollows of her cheeks, in the lost look in her eyes. But Robb saw a grim determination there as well. He, too, felt the biting ache of sorrow for friends and bannermen who'd fallen, and guilt that he had led them into that slaughter. But beneath that, coiling in the pit of his belly, was a white-hot anger that threatened to consume him. For the first time in his life, the war was personal in a way that even Ned Stark's execution had not been. It was no longer a matter of justice or duty alone. It was vengeance. They had tried to butcher him and his mother at a wedding feast. They had slaughtered his men in violation of guest right. And they had failed to kill him. The wound in his side healed slowly, but each day it closed bit by bit, leaving a jagged scar. Surviving the infection felt like a small victory, and as he mended, he and the remnants of his council, small though it was, plotted what came next. Northmen could be rallied. House Manderley was still strong in White Harbor. House Reed in the Neck had not bent to the Boltons. The Karstarks might be lost to him, but there were other families who would avenge the Red Wedding if Robb could but find a way to rally them. And there were rumors that Stannis Baratheon had survived a defeat at Blackwater and was rallying in the north, that the Night's Watch faced some cataclysm beyond the wall. Rumors of dragons across the sea. He was weary, worn, wounded, and though he had lost so many, he realized that in surviving the twins, in refusing to die when so many had, he had become something more than just the king in the north. The Northmen who had seen him come out of that cursed feast alive began to whisper that the old gods themselves had shielded him. Some talked in quiet, reverential tones, that the spirit of the direwolf had truly taken up residence in his heart. In the days to come, those whispers only grew. Word spread among the small folk of Westeros that the young wolf was not so easily caged. They told stories of how Grey Wind had broken chains, how he had killed half a dozen Frey men himself to protect his master. Some said Robb had passed beyond the brink of death and come back with the blessings of the old gods. They whispered new names for him: Ghost King, the wolf who would not die, the Howling King. And in the face of Bolton treachery, those who still believed in the North's autonomy clung to these legends. The seeds of a renewed rebellion began to take root. Yet events did not remain still across the realm. Tywin Lannister took the news of Robb's survival poorly. He demanded the head of the boy who had bested every Lannister host in the field. Roose Bolton, newly proclaimed Warden of the North by the Iron Throne, found himself forced to move more quickly than he might have liked to stamp out the lingering Stark loyalty in the North. The Freys fumed, for Robb's life was a stain upon their supposed triumph, an echo of how their perfect trap had gone awry. The next chapter of conflict flared when Bolton's men tried to overtake White Harbor. Wyman Manderley, a cunning lord who had feigned deference to the Iron Throne after Ned Stark's death, still seethed over the Red Wedding. When the Bolton banners arrived at his doorstep, Manderley pretended to welcome them, only to turn on them after a feast of his own. In a bitter twist of irony, Manderley decided that two could play at the game Walder Frey had invented. He slaughtered the Bolton men under guest right and raised the Stark banner in open defiance. Word of that slaughter traveled fast, and soon the realm knew that the North was far from subdued. Quietly, Robb and his mother ventured north in disguise, accompanied by the few who remained fiercely loyal. With them rode Grey Wind, always near Robb's side, an ever-present symbol of the primal bond between the Starks and the old gods. The journey was fraught with peril. Spies were everywhere. Freys, Lannister men, and Boltons alike sought the fugitive king in the north. But the small folk were still loyal. Stories spread quickly, and many a crofter or brewer's wife opened their door in secret, gave them a warm meal, and pointed the way north with a trembling smile. In the night, when Robb allowed himself to ache, he thought of his father's words about duty, about doing the right thing, even when the cost was high. He grieved for the men who'd given their lives at the Twins. He remembered the faint gleam of pride he used to see in his mother's eyes when she thought of her boy as king in the North. That boy was gone now. In his place was a man haunted by war and betrayal, but resolute in the knowledge that there would be no peace until justice was done. They arrived at White Harbor under the cover of darkness. The city's proud walls and towers rose from the gloom, and for the first time, Robb felt a glimmer of hope. Lord Wyman Manderley himself ushered them inside, bowing his head in respect to Robb as soon as they entered the man's private solar. Manderley was rotund, with a booming voice and cunning eyes. He confirmed that he'd spurned the Boltons, that the city stood ready to declare for House Stark once again. Sir Wendell Manderley, who had escaped the Red Wedding, was there too, battered but alive, and his eyes shone with tears of relief when he saw Robb. They embraced like brothers. It was enough to stir the faint embers of courage into a small flame once more. Soon men flocked to White Harbor. Rills, Dustins, Flints, all those houses that had served the Starks for generations, began to slip away from the Bolton yoke. They came in small numbers at first, warily testing to see if Robb was truly alive. But once they beheld him, once they saw the scar on his side and the cold fury in his eyes, they bent the knee anew. The city grew crowded with Northerners who meant to fight. No man believed it would be easy, for Bolton had the dread fort and a cruel host of men at his disposal, along with the advantage of Tywin Lannister's favor. But the young wolf had returned, and that alone rallied hearts. A letter arrived, carried by a half-frozen messenger who risked passing the neck under the cover of swamp fog. It was from Howland Reed, loyal bannerman and friend of Ned Stark. His words were brief, telling Robb of events along the neck, and how the Boltons had sent men to seize Greywater Watch. Reed's men had turned them aside using cunning bog warfare, and for now, the path to the north remained tricky for any large army. He offered further support and knowledge of the land. In the midst of that brewing storm, Catelyn Stark spoke to her son each night, reminding him of the duty they owed the realm, not just the north. She told him of the chaos swirling in King's Landing, Joffrey's cruelty, the Tyrells' uneasy alliance with the Lannisters, and rumors that Tyrion Lannister was contending with his father. She reminded him that the Iron Islands still reaved the western coast, that Balon Greyjoy might yet strike again. She reminded him of Stannis Baratheon at the Wall, who had come to the Night's Watch's aid according to the ravens that sometimes made it south. Robb realized, with a clarity born of loss, that the war was changing. Where once he'd fought for the North's independence, now all Westeros seemed on the brink of something more profound. A collapse or a rebirth. The White Walkers were no longer just an old tale, if the ravens from the Wall were to be believed. If the dead truly walked, if winter was truly coming in the darkest sense, then perhaps the realm would need more than just a rebellion. It would need unity. It would need a High King. These thoughts battered at Robb's mind like a tempest while he sharpened his sword in Lord Manderley's courtyard, while he listened to men pledge their swords to House Stark, while he gazed at the White Harbor under a gray sky streaked with gulls. The talk was hushed at first, a rumor slipping from one man to another, that Robb Stark, the resurrected king in the north, might not only reclaim his birthright, but take the entire realm for his own. The name, High King, emerged from an old tradition that had not been used in centuries, an echo of the Age of Heroes, when the first men spoke of a single ruler who united all the petty kings of Westeros. It was a mad idea. The Targaryens had once been that uniting force, but their line had all but vanished, except for rumors of Daenerys Targaryen across the sea. And Robert Baratheon had called himself King of the Seven Kingdoms, but had never used the title High King. Yet the realm was splintering, and the threat from the north was too great to ignore. Catelyn, with tears in her eyes, told Robb that perhaps it was time for the Starks to bring the realm together, if only to save it from the nightmares that lurked beyond the Wall, and from the nightmares that wore Lannister crimson and Frey gray. But first, Robb had to reclaim the north. He gathered his strength, forging alliances anew. Men from the Mountains of the Moon, spurred on by uncertain alliances with the Vale, began to appear in the White Harbor region, quietly acknowledging that they remembered Ned Stark's sister was wed to Jon Arryn's heir. There were cracks in the realm that might be exploited, and ironically, the Boltons were stretched thin, trying to hold the north by fear alone. Winterfell lay in ruins still, after Theon Greyjoy's disastrous takeover. Men remembered House Stark with longing as they looked upon the once proud castle, burned and blackened. So Robb marched. His mother remained in White Harbor, protected by Manderley's men, while Robb led an army of Northerners, less numerous than the host he'd once commanded, but fierce and hungry for justice. Grey Wind loped at the head of the column, his presence enough to set the men's hearts hammering with pride. The old gods guided them, or so they believed, through roads thick with snow, across rivers bridged by ice, until they met the Bolton forces near the last river. It was the height of winter's gloom, with the days short and the nights cold enough to crack skin. The battle that followed was not large by the standards of the War of the Five Kings, but it was savage. The Bolton men had numbers and cunning, but the morale was not there. They fought out of fear of their own lords, more than out of loyalty. The Stark forces fought with a fanatic fire, driven by vengeance and the knowledge of the betrayal at the twins. Snow flurries whirled across the battlefield, swirling around men locked in mortal combat. It was the first time since the Red Wedding that Robb had taken the field, his side still aching with every breath. He could barely fit into his armor the way he used to, but once the sword was in his hand, something unyielding settled into his bones. Roose Bolton was not there. He had remained at the Dreadfort, sending his bastard Ramsay to command in his stead. Ramsay, infamous for his cruelty, proved no match for the united fury of the Northern Lords. The Boltons' line wavered, then broke. Ramsay himself fled, howling curses. Robb's men rode him down, capturing him in the forest north of the battlefield. He was hauled before Robb, his face bruised, but still sneering. Robb looked at him for a long moment, remembering tales of Ramsay's atrocities. Then he nodded once. They beheaded Ramsay there on the field, placing his head on a spear. Some men called for greater tortures, but Robb refused. Enough blood had been spilled. The Boltons' line splintered, and more men bent the knee to the Stark banner. It was a victory, but a costly one. More men died, friends who had stayed loyal from the start. Their bodies were buried beneath the snow, their names chiseled in the hearts of the survivors. The Northerners marched onward to the Dreadfort, where Roose Bolton had fortified himself behind thick walls and an even thicker ring of fear. But fear was a poor match for righteous wrath. The siege of the Dreadfort lasted longer than the men might have liked, but eventually, through cunning, sabotage, and a final assault, the fortress fell. Roose Bolton was discovered trying to slip away in the night. He was taken in a root cellar, where men found him cowering with a few of his most trusted guards. In a grim echo of the Red Wedding, Robb refused to spare him. He stood outside the Dreadfort gates and pronounced sentence, remembering how his father had always been the one to swing the sword himself. With a cold finality, Robb separated the traitor's head from his shoulders. The men cheered as the pale face of the Lord of the Dreadfort tumbled into the mud. It was done. The Boltons had fallen. The Freys were too far in the south to press an immediate threat, and for the moment, the north was free. The direwolf banner of House Stark flew again over Winterfell, though the castle remained in ruins. Robb returned to that blackened shell of a keep with a heavy heart. Here, his younger brothers had vanished, and for all he knew they had been murdered by Theon. Here, his sister Sansa had once lived, though she was now in King's Landing, or perhaps even further away, as a hostage of the Lannisters. Arya was gone. No one knew where. Rickon, too, vanished. Bran was rumored to be dead. This was the price war had exacted on the Starks, once the wardens of the North. As winter deepened, Robb turned his attention south. He knew the Lannisters would not rest until he was vanquished. Tywin was cunning, and King's Landing was still the seat of power. Manderley spies told him the Iron Throne had declared Robb Stark an outlaw, that the boy King Tommen, who had succeeded Joffrey after the viciously rumored death of the latter, was a puppet for Tywin's ambitions. The Tyrells under Mace Tyrell were pressing a wave of marriages and alliances, ensuring their place in King's Landing. Meanwhile, the Freys fumed, their humiliation complete when rumors of Walder's failings spread. The Crown had tried to award them with titles and spoils, but those were ashes compared to the victory they had desired. The Freys wanted Robb's head. Catelyn arrived at Winterfell soon after the castle was retaken, escorted by a strong guard from White Harbor. She embraced her son at the gates, tears falling at the sight of the burned towers, the collapsed walls. They prayed together in the Godswood, kneeling before the Heart Tree. She told him about fresh tidings, of letters that had arrived from the Vale and from Stannis Baratheon at the Wall, inviting the Starks to treat with him. She spoke, too, of a rumor that Daenerys Targaryen had crossed the narrow sea with dragons and an army of freed slaves. Westeros was in flux, the old alliances and dominions cracking like thin ice. Robb listened. The idea of forging a new path for the realm, of uniting it under a single throne for the sake of confronting the looming threat from beyond the wall, tugged at him. It seemed at times like an impossible dream. He was but one man, a young king who had lost too many battles, too many friends. Yet who else was uniting the realm? Who else held the trust of the old gods, the knowledge of winter's true teeth? Stannis fought at the wall, but his cause was overshadowed by the memory of his defeat at Blackwater, and he had no love from the southern lords. Daenerys was far away, her dragons rumored but unseen by most of Westeros. The Lannisters, for all their wealth, were fracturing, especially after the death of Tywin Lannister at the hands of his son Tyrion, a fresh rumor that had set King's Landing into uproar. Then came the ravens from the Night's Watch. The messages were dire, describing an undead threat. Whites and White Walkers, the others creeping into the realm. They pleaded for unity, for men to defend the wall. And there was a note from Jon Snow, the new Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, if the rumors were to be believed. Robb's half-brother, sworn to the Watch, leading the men in black against nightmares from the far north. Catelyn gave Robb a careful look as she delivered that news, for she had never been fond of Jon Snow, who stood as a living reminder of Ned Stark's supposed infidelity. But she did not speak ill of him now. The times were too grave. Robb knew the truth in his heart. The realm needed a leader who would take the threat of the others seriously. And the old gods, be it superstition or something deeper, seemed to nudge him toward that role. The north was his, the Riverlands might be reclaimed if he could strike back at the Freys, and after that, the path to King's Landing lay open. The Tyrells might resist, or might be persuaded, if they believed the Lannisters were weak enough. The Dornish, still bitter about Elia Martell's fate, might side with someone who opposed the crown. House Arryn, with the Vale's knights, might be coaxed into an alliance through family ties. It was the stuff of madness. But so too had been the idea that Robb Stark would survive the Red Wedding. If the old gods had carried him this far, perhaps they had a larger design in mind. For nights he walked in the silent godswood of Winterfell, leaning on the trunk of the heart tree, thinking of battles to come. He laid his sword on the snow-covered ground and made silent vows. He would not rest until the traitors were punished. He would not kneel until the realm was safe from the cold. And in those hushes, he felt as though the wind murmured back. Or perhaps it was only his imagination. He wrote letters to every great house of Westeros, appealing not just to old alliances, but to the common threat. He wrote to Stannis, acknowledging his rightful claim to the Iron Throne, but insisting that the entire realm must be united. He wrote to the Tyrells, reminding them that the Lannisters were a sinking ship, and inviting them to consider a new alliance. He wrote to Dorne, promising to answer old grievances if the Martells would rise in the name of justice. And he wrote to the Vale, appealing to the memory of Ned Stark's sister, who had once grown up there. Time passed as the North prepared. The Northmen might have marched south at once, but the roads were choked with snow, and the men needed to repair their gear. Winter was hardly an easy season to wage war. Yet, in the midst of that cold, an envoy arrived from the Vale. Petyr Baelish, cunning and smooth-tongued. He claimed to represent Lord Robin Arryn, though rumors said Baelish held the real power. He spoke flattering words. He bowed and teased out alliances with gentle, insinuating phrases. Robb hated every moment of it, for Baelish reeked of intrigue and betrayal. But Baelish had come to treat with the king in the north, acknowledging his claim. He hinted that if Robb could prove a stable path forward, the Vale Knights might join him. He also dangled the possibility of Sansa's rescue, if the rumors that Baelish was sheltering her in the Vale were to be believed. Robb clenched his jaw. The name of his sister stirred that protective wrath in him. He agreed to parley further, if Baelish returned with Sansa to prove his good faith. Baelish smiled his thin smile, made assurances, and vanished into the swirling snow, promising to return with an answer soon. Meanwhile, letters came from the Riverlands. The Blackfish, Brynden Tully, had taken up arms in the name of House Tully, defending River Run against Frey siege. They were isolated and outnumbered, But the arrival of the hound, Sandor Clegane, rumored to be traveling with a young girl, had tipped some skirmishes. There was talk that girl might be Arya Stark, though no one knew for certain. The Freys were pinched between fighting the Blackfish and contending with bandits and outlaws who had grown bolder. The Riverlands bled. Robb vowed he would free his mother's ancestral home. To do so, he needed a larger army, and for that he needed the loyalty of the entire North. House Glover, House Serwyn, House Tallhart, House Mormont. Some had been battered by the war. Some had lost men to the Red Wedding, but all had a burning desire for vengeance. One by one, the battered houses rallied. Provisions were gathered. Smiths toiled to forge new steel. The Manderleys brought fish and grain from White Harbor. The Umbers, outraged by the death of the Great John, raised a fierce contingent of men, determined to avenge him. Winterfell itself slowly came alive again, as families returned, rebuilding walls and roofing. Smoke drifted from the repaired chimneys in the great keep. When at last spring threatened to break the grip of winter, though it was rumored this winter might be longer than usual, Robb called his banners. Thousands answered. Not the grand numbers of the early days of the war, but enough to march on the Riverlands with a credible force. Grey Wind, standing at Robb's side, seemed larger than ever, his yellow eyes scanning the crowd. Every man there recalled the legend of the Red Wedding, how Grey Wind had torn through ranks of Freys, how the young wolf had returned from the grave. Their cheers shook the newly rebuilt walls of Winterfell. Thus began the slow march south. They crossed the neck with the Reed's guidance. Frey outriders tried to harass them but were driven off easily. The roads were treacherous, the fields muddy and dotted with rotting corpses from old battles. In villages, the people stared with wide eyes, half terrified and half hopeful at the sight of Stark banners. In the distance, smoke from burned farmsteads curled into the sky. The entire land seemed weary of war, battered by the ravages of the last few years. When the Stark host arrived at Moat Cailin, already reclaimed from the Ironborn by the Reeds, Robb paused to let the men rest. He took counsel with his lords, discussing strategy. He knew River Run was the next major objective. By securing it, he would rescue the Blackfish, and with luck, strengthen ties to the Tully bannermen. That would also place him uncomfortably close to the Westerlands, which might provoke a Lannister response. But Tywin Lannister was dead, Tyrion presumably exiled after murdering his father. Kevan Lannister supposedly held the reins in King's Landing, though the new small council was fractious. The Tyrells had too many ambitions of their own. If ever there was a time to strike, it was now. And so the North marched on, forging through the Riverlands. Scouts brought word that Brynden Tully's forces were still pinned in River Run by Frey and Lannister men, though the numbers were fewer now. The siege had grown lax and half-hearted, for the Lannisters didn't have the patience to keep pouring resources into the Riverlands, especially with unrest in King's Landing and Dorne's increasing hostility. Walder Frey's family couldn't coordinate effectively, as internal feuds had erupted once Walder's health began to fail. Some whispered that the old Lord of the Crossing was on his deathbed, and that his dozens of heirs were already squabbling. Robb's arrival in the Riverlands was heralded by peasants who rushed to the roads, cheering his army. They might have once belonged to House Frey or House Lannister by the fortunes of war, but after years of pillaging they wanted peace, or at least some justice. To them, the young king in the north, rumored to have cheated death, symbolized a chance to break the cycle of bloodshed. They made camp within a day's ride of River Run. Scouts reported that the Freys holding the siege lines were unprepared for a large force. They had no illusions that a direct assault would be without cost, but morale was high, and Robb saw the shape of an opportunity. The next morning, as mists clung to the rolling green of the Riverlands, Robb led his vanguard forward. The river's waters glinted silver in the early light. He saw the walls of River Run, and beyond them, the proud towers that had once been Catelyn's home. The Frey banners, gray and blue, hung from hastily built siege towers. A scattering of Lannister red and gold fluttered among them, manned by mercenaries or conscripts. Robb was no stranger to the shock of battle, but a part of him clenched as he recalled the last time He'd faced Freys in earnest. Yet he had thousands of Northmen at his back, and he had Grey Wind at his side. With a cry, they charged. The Freys had scarcely formed up before the cavalry smashed into their lines, hacking through startled men. Trumpets blared, steel rang, and the battered banners of House Stark soared overhead. A second wave of foot soldiers pressed in behind. It was, in the grand tapestry of the war, a relatively quick fight. The Freys, outnumbered, quickly realized they had no chance. Many turned and fled rather than risk capture. The Lannister contingent fought more stubbornly, but once they saw their allies break, they too began to rout. Riverlands' defenders joined the fray from inside, opening the gates under the Blackfish's command and taking the besiegers by surprise. The final pockets of resistance were quickly surrounded and forced to yield or face slaughter. Brynden Tully himself rode out, battered armor glinting in the sun, a fierce grin on his lined face. He met Robb by the riverside. They clasped forearms, the old warrior and the young, the last of the Tully men who had resisted the Red Wedding. Brendan's relief was plain. He had fought a desperate guerrilla campaign for the better part of a year, and seeing the Stark host was a balm to old wounds. Catelyn's uncle bowed his head, acknowledging Robb as his king. When Riverrun's gate swung wide for the northern host, it felt like a homecoming of sorts. Men embraced, women wept with relief. Catelyn arrived a day later, escorted by a contingent that had trailed behind. Her reunion with the Blackfish was tearful, but both carried the sorrow of what had been lost. They comforted each other with the knowledge that the Freys had failed, that Riverrun was free. In the great hall of Riverrun, the banners of House Stark and House Tully hung side by side. Lords from the Trident came to bend the knee, seeing that the tides of war had shifted again. Some had once sworn loyalty to the Iron Throne for fear of Lannister reprisal, but that no longer seemed wise. A hush spread through the crowd as the Blackfish rose to speak, proclaiming Robb not only king in the north, but rightful overlord of the Riverlands by blood through his mother's line. A thunderous cheer shook the walls. The feast that followed was a shadow of what it would have been in happier times. Food was scarce, many had lost loved ones, but it was still a celebration of liberation. After the feast, as Robb sat in quiet reflection, Grey Wind curled at his feet. He contemplated the next step. King in the north, Lord of the Riverlands. 2 kingdoms out of 7, if one used the old Targaryen partition. Yet he had more. Manderly's ships in White Harbor, the cunning tactics of the Reeds in the Neck, alliances with some mountain clans in the Vale through Baelish's precarious dealings. The realm was not fully his, not yet, and many challenges lay ahead. The Lannisters, for all their troubles, still had King's Landing, its gold and the seat of power. The Tyrells might try to seize control outright. Dorne was an unknown factor, cautious yet smoldering with old resentments. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen was rumored to have conquered Marianne. Would she sail for Westeros soon, dragons in tow? There was the matter of Stannis Baratheon, the man who had crowned himself king after Robert's death. By some accounts, Stannis and Jon Snow had fought side by side against the wildlings at the Wall. If White Walkers truly threatened, Robb considered that a partnership with Stannis might serve the realm best. But Stannis would never bend the knee to a pretender, nor would the proud man from Dragonstone easily share his claim. Yet Robb had no desire to battle a man who was defending the realm's northern border from nightmares. Perhaps for the sake of survival, they could find a way to stand together. Days turned to weeks in Riverrun as repairs were made, farms were planted, and outlaws quelled. Robb's men scoured the surrounding territories, bringing peace, or at least a respite from chaos. The news that Walder Frey had died in his bed reached them with little fanfare, replaced by the reality that his heirs squabbled among themselves. The twins were in disarray, vulnerable. Some said it was time for Robb to ride in and put the Freys to the sword, once and for all. Others counseled caution, for the Lannisters might yet reinforce the crossing. Meanwhile, word came from King's Landing. Tommen still sat the throne, but Kevin Lannister had been assassinated under mysterious circumstances, and the city was on edge. Cersei Lannister, presumably still reeling from the loss of Joffrey and Tywin, was rumored to be orchestrating various gambits to preserve her power. The Tyrell presence grew stronger by the day, with Margaery Tyrell now effectively the queen. They might soon turn their attention north to crush the resurgent Stark power, or they might look east to the potential threat of dragons. It was impossible to say. Robb was no stranger to war, but he understood that if he wanted the realm united, he had to offer more than swords. He had to offer hope, justice, and stability. He drafted messages to Dorne, to the Vale again, even to the Iron Islands, proposing a grand council to address the common threats. He pledged to revoke old injustices if they would come to the table. It was the approach of a statesman, not just a warlord. The irony was not lost on him that he was adopting a more conciliatory stance, even as he prepared for the next inevitable conflict. Then, unexpectedly, a raven arrived bearing the sigil of the Night's Watch. It carried a terse message from Jon Snow, who wrote that winter's grip was tightening, that strange creatures were seen ranging closer to the wall, that the wildlings had been permitted to pass south in exchange for their help against the real enemy. He wrote that if the rest of the realm did not unite soon, all the crowns in the world would not stop the deathly tide. Reading those words, Robb felt a chill that went beyond the winter wind. This was not simply about revenge or feudal claims anymore. It was about the survival of mankind. What would it take, then, to become High King of Westeros? It was a thought that dogged Robb's steps. He had never sought such a grand title. His father had been content to rule the North from Winterfell, to remain loyal to the Targaryens until Robert's rebellion turned everything upside down. But times had changed. The realm was shattered and leaderless. The Lannisters were despised. The Baratheons were nearly extinguished except for Stannis. The Targaryen girl was across the sea. If a high king could rally all the lords, all the men of every kingdom, perhaps they stood a chance against the coming winter. He spoke of this in confidence to the Blackfish and Catelyn. Brynden Tully regarded him with a cool, assessing gaze, then nodded. If we do not stand united, the darkness will swallow us. You have the North, and now the Riverlands. The Freys are a shadow of themselves. The Vale waits to see which way the winds blow. Dorne is outraged at the Lannisters, and may welcome a new, fairer suitor. If you treat with Stannis, if you can find common cause. Catelyn listened, tears in her eyes. Ned never wanted this, but he knew his duty. If you believe you must wear a crown to fulfill that duty, then I will not stand against you. She placed a hand on Robb's cheek. But I fear what will become of you, my son. This crown has already taken so much from us. Robb squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her concern but firm in his resolve. All the crowns in the realm are worthless if the realm itself is destroyed. The real enemy is coming. We must be strong enough to face it, together. Naden. It was a vow that guided him as the months wore on, as alliances were carefully forged or shattered, as the battered realm tried to find its footing. Riverrun became a beacon of hope for those who despised the Lannisters. Men from the Vale trickled in, quietly acknowledging that House Arryn had lost direction under the regency of Lysa, and then under the manipulations of Petyr Baelish. Some from the Westerlands, hearing of the turmoil in King's Landing, slipped away to join the Stark cause, though they were fewer. Dorne responded with cautious interest, requesting a formal envoy. Baelish did eventually return, wearing a smirk and accompanied by a hooded young woman who turned out not to be Sansa, but some pretender meant to coax more concessions from Robb. Robb's fury was immediate, and only the memory of how quickly anger could lead to disaster kept him from ordering Baelish's immediate death. The man was too cunning. He offered plausible excuses, speaking in half-truths. He teased the possibility that Sansa was hidden away safely in the Vale, that a formal betrothal could be arranged, but only if the Vale's knights were guaranteed certain lands and considerations. Robb's teeth ground as he listened. He dismissed Baelish with a warning that if he learned Sansa had been harmed, no corner of Westeros would hide Baelish from his wrath. Baelish only bowed with his mocking little grin and took his leave. Despite these frustrations, progress came in other forms. The key lords of the Riverlands and the North agreed to sign a formal pact, recognizing Robb Stark as King of the North and the Trident, and as rightful claimant to any expansions he might undertake. They pledged troops to fight the White Walkers should the threat prove real. Ravens from the Night's Watch continued to stress the urgency, describing small battles in the far north, raids on villages, chilling stories of reanimated corpses. Grimly, Robb prepared for a two-front war, one against the undead in the north, and one against the Lannister regime if it dared stand in his way. Then, as the realm braced itself for another summer or for the deeper cold, news exploded across the land. Daenerys Targaryen had landed in Dorne. She brought with her 3 dragons, though some reports said they were still young, and a horde of unsullied troops. Dorne welcomed her, for she promised vengeance for Elia Martell. The sands stirred to life, and a wave of Southern Alliance threatened to sweep across the Stormlands, where pockets of Baratheon loyalists still lingered. Suddenly, the War of the Five Kings seemed a smaller prelude to the War of the Five Claims. Targaryen, Stark, Lannister, through Tommen, Stannis Baratheon, and even the Greyjoys, who still clung to the Iron Islands. Robb received a raven from Dorne, from Prince Doran Martell, proposing a discussion of terms. If Robb would cede or share certain rights, if he would acknowledge Daenerys' claim to the Iron Throne, then perhaps she would acknowledge the independence of the North, or even his claim as High King in a new arrangement. It was a tangle of possibilities and pitfalls. Robb knew that the dragons posed a threat no conventional army could ignore. Yet Daenerys herself was rumored to be young, untested in the great game of Westerosi politics. Did she truly have the realm's best interests at heart, or was she just another conqueror? Councils were held, strategies debated. Some of Robb's lords urged immediate alliance with Daenerys, thinking the combined might of their forces, unsullied in the south, hardened northerners in the center, could crush the Lannisters easily, then turn north to battle the White Walkers. Others warned that kneeling to Daenerys would only place the realm under another Targaryen dynasty. The notion of an equal partnership, forging a new monarchy that recognized both House Targaryen and House Stark, floated in the background. Yet every day, ravens from the wall spoke of growing peril. It was then that Stannis Baratheon struck. He marched south from the wall with the disciplined force of northerners who had flocked to him after he aided the Watch. He aimed to seize Winterfell, to stake his claim as the rightful king and gather supporters. But Winterfell, though battered, was well garrisoned by men loyal to Robb. They repelled Stannis' vanguard. A tense standoff ensued. Robb, upon hearing of it, was torn. He did not want to shed more blood in the north, not when the real battle lay beyond the wall. So he broke off from the Riverlands campaign, leaving his mother in the Blackfish to secure that territory, and rode north with a small contingent of loyal knights and a faster cavalry. He met Stannis on the snowy fields outside Winterfell's walls. For hours they parleyed, each claiming the rightful kingship. Stannis bristled at the mention of the White Walkers, for he had seen some signs of the threat, but was fixated on the Iron Throne. His Red Priestess, Melisandre, stood at his side, eyes flickering with an otherworldly flame. She studied Robb, and her gaze lingered on the scar on his side. She murmured strange words about the Lord of Light, and how the North was touched by an ancient power. Robb offered Stannis a compromise: help him unite the realm against the White Walkers and the Lannisters, and in return, Stannis would be granted the Stormlands and recognized for his valor. But Stannis insisted the Iron Throne was his by right, that the realm needed a single king with legitimate claim. Their conversation nearly ended in violence, but memories of Ned Stark's sense of honor and the knowledge that war between them would only weaken the realm tempered both sides. They parted uneasily with no final agreement, but the seeds of a truce had been planted. Stannis withdrew to the northern mountains, promising not to harass Winterfell so long as Robb did not impede his further campaigns. The watchers on Winterfell's walls breathed a collective sigh of relief. Back in Riverrun, the question of forging a direct alliance with Daenerys escalated. The Targaryen queen had marched north out of Dorne, capturing several key forts in the Stormlands. She was rumored to have the backing of House Martell, and possibly the secret support of some of the Reach Lords who had grown uneasy with Lannister rule. If she reached King's Landing, Tommen's reign might end in a matter of moons. Robb considered that scenario carefully. If Daenerys toppled the Lannisters, would she secure the entire realm for herself? Or would she see reason and turn her forces northward to fight the true threat? Time weighed heavily on him. The White Walkers would not wait. They marched with the inexorable pace of the seasons. He recalled Jon Snow's repeated pleas. By now, the wildlings had been let through the wall, seeking refuge in the gift. The Night's Watch was stretched thin, even with Stannis' partial support. The armies of the living had to unite, or the dawn might never come. The day the letter arrived announcing that Daenerys Targaryen had accepted negotiations with Robb Stark was a day historians would later point to as a turning point. She called him a fellow monarch, recognized the North's independence as a fait accompli, and invited him to discuss a broader alliance. The location proposed was neutral ground, a small fishing town near the Blackwater Bay, not far from the burn-scarred remains of the woods outside King's Landing. She also extended the invitation to Stannis Baratheon, to the Vale, to Dorne, to the Tyrells, though whether any of them would come was uncertain. Robb was advised by many to decline. It could be a trap, reminiscent of the Red Wedding. But he felt the memory of that betrayal searing within him, and he vowed never to be such a fool again. This time, it would be done on neutral ground with strict conditions, no wedding feasts. And the alternative, continuing to wage war while the others loomed, seemed far worse. So he agreed. He wrote back with equal caution, demanding hostages be exchanged to ensure safety. Daenerys countered with a suggestion that her Unsullied would stand guard for all delegations, that no one come with more than 50 men. Catelyn, terrified for her son, tried to dissuade him. But Robb pressed on. He remembered that once, Walder Frey had offered him bread and salt, only to betray him. This time, the bread and salt would be accepted under the watchful eyes of thousands, with checks in place. He assured his mother that he would have a plan if betrayal reared its head again. But some part of him wanted to believe that Daenerys Targaryen was different, that she was not Walder Frey or Tywin Lannister. She had freed slaves in Essos, if the stories were true. She might genuinely care for her people. Thus, in a hush of tension, the king in the north rode south once more, accompanied by a small retinue, including the Blackfish and a carefully chosen group of loyal knights and retainers. Grey Wind, enormous and imposing, padded alongside him, drawing gasps of fear and awe from the small folk in every village they passed. The negotiations would take place in the burnt ruins of an old fishing wharf near the mouth of the Blackwater, a few miles from King's Landing, far enough that the Gold Cloaks could not intervene without warning. Daenerys' forces had approached from the east, establishing a temporary camp. Robb's party arrived from the west, setting up tents and watchfires. On the appointed morning, Daenerys Targaryen emerged, escorted by gray-skinned Unsullied, who marched with impeccable discipline. 2 dragons circled overhead, smaller than the fabled beasts of old Valyria, but still terrifying to behold. Their shadows scythed across the ground, making horses snort and rear. Robb felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. A sense of awe mingled with foreboding. He reminded himself that Grey Wind was at his side, that his own men stood ready. Daenerys was young, silver-haired, her eyes bright with confidence. She greeted Robb politely, addressing him as, "Your Grace." He could sense her measuring him, just as he measured her. She had a grace to her, but also a core of steel. She did not flinch at the sight of Grey Wind. Instead, she seemed intrigued, perhaps seeing in the direwolf a kindred symbol of primal power. They spoke in a large pavilion with open sides, so that all could see. Lords, soldiers, and various onlookers ringed them at a distance. The tension was palpable. Any sign of treachery would lead to immediate bloodshed. But they traded words instead of blows. Daenerys spoke of freeing Westeros from the Lannisters. Robb spoke of the threat from the north, the White Walkers, which overshadowed any ambition for the Iron Throne. He suggested that if she truly cared for the people of the realm, she must unite with the North against this ancient enemy. She frowned, uncertain. Old tales of ice demons seemed remote to someone who had grown up in exile. But she had heard from other sources, possibly from Melisandre or from scouts near Eastwatch by the Sea, that there were strange happenings in the far north. Then she revealed a remarkable piece of news. Jon Snow had sent her a letter as well, describing the threat in dire terms, urging her to forge alliances and forget the squabbles of lesser kings. He had ended his letter by describing the oath of the Night's Watch, to guard the realms of men. Daenerys admitted she found his words compelling. Robb felt a pang in his chest as he realized Jon Snow was out there, in black, defending them all. He wondered if he might ever see his half-brother again. A hush settled. Daenerys studied Robb's face, glimpsing the hint of sorrow and determination in his gray eyes. She nodded slowly, as though making up her mind. Then she declared that if the White Walkers were real, if the North required aid, she would offer it, but only if Robb recognized her as the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. A murmur rippled through Robb's retinue. They remembered well how they had proclaimed him king in the North. How could they kneel again to a Targaryen? Robb remained calm, looking Daenerys in the eyes. He spoke of the tradition of the First Men, of the North's long history of independence before Aegon's conquest, of the blood spilled in this recent war. Then he uttered a fateful proposal. "Let us forge a new Westeros," he said, voice steady, "where each region has its rulers, loyal to a single high king or queen. Let us bring an end to the tyranny that sees lords butcher each other for a single seat of power. If I bend the knee to you, will you acknowledge me as your warden in the North? King in name if you must, but your ally in truth. If we are to stand against the cold, we must—" She tilted her head, considering. This was not the subjugation she might have expected. This was a partnership, a power-sharing arrangement. She weighed it against her desire for absolute rule. Overhead the dragon circled. Gray wind let out a low growl. The watchers held their breath. After what felt like an eternity, Daenerys gave a small nod. "I came here to break the wheel," she said. "Perhaps this is how it begins." The negotiations continued for hours. The details were messy. The recognition of northern autonomy, the distribution of lands, the question of succession, the freedom of the Riverlands. They found some compromises. Daenerys insisted that to unify Westeros effectively against the White Walkers, she needed a show of loyalty from Robb, some oath, some gesture. He considered it, thinking of how his father once swore loyalty to King Robert for the good of the realm. If it saved countless lives, perhaps pride should not stand in the way. When the agreement was finally hammered out, it was a fragile thing. Daenerys would be recognized as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but the North would remain largely autonomous, loyal as an ally rather than a vassal. The Riverlands, as part of the King in the North's domain, would likewise enjoy some measure of self-governance, though acknowledging Daenerys' paramount rule in matters affecting all the realm. Together, they would march on King's Landing to depose Tommen and the Lannisters, either by negotiation or by force if they refused to yield. Afterward, all the forces of the realm, North, Dorne, the Reach, if it sided with Daenerys, and the Crown Lands would unite to march beyond the Neck and face the true enemy in the North. A hush fell on the crowd when Daenerys and Robb clasped hands before all assembled. A Targaryen queen, last scion of her line, and a Stark king, the man who had once been butchered in the Red Wedding but survived. Many realized they were witnessing history. Whether it would usher in peace or simply plunge them into a new, darker conflict remained to be seen. The meeting ended without bloodshed. The watchers exhaled. Both sides kept a wary eye on each other as they withdrew to their camps, but the sense that a grand shift had occurred was undeniable. Some men whispered that if dragons and direwolves had made a pact, perhaps the realm stood a chance after all. Others muttered that an alliance born of necessity might quickly unravel once the Lannisters were gone. But for now, a fragile hope sparked. Robb rode away from that meeting with heart pounding. He had made a sacrifice of his pride, in a sense, by acknowledging Daenerys' higher claim. But in doing so, he secured the North's autonomy and a chance to unite the realm against the Walking Dead. The memory of Jon Snow's pleas rang in his mind. That was the true war, not these petty battles over a throne of swords. If Daenerys truly had the heart of a queen and the might of dragons, then perhaps they could triumph. If not, Westeros would burn. either in dragonfire or in the endless winter. Word spread like wildfire. The king in the north and the dragon queen had joined forces. The effect on the realm was immediate. Some lords, formerly sworn to Tommen, began to waver, uncertain if the Lannisters could prevail now that dragons soared in their skies. The Freys, fractured and leaderless, wondered if they should throw open the twins to the combined host. The Vale, under Baelish's manipulations, debated whether to side with the Starks or stay neutral. Stannis Baratheon fumed in the north, seeing another pretender ally with the boy he refused to acknowledge. But even he had to concede that taking Winterfell by force now would be suicide, with the Targaryen alliance looming. An unstoppable cascade seemed poised to sweep through King's Landing. The Tyrells, calculating as ever, decided to see if they could negotiate favorable terms with Daenerys, rather than risk a destructive invasion. At the last moment, Margaery Tyrell persuaded Tommen to consider surrender. Cersei Lannister was outraged, but her power had waned since Tywin's death, and she could do little but watch as the Tyrells orchestrated a bloodless coup, ousting Tommen in a carefully staged transition of power. When Daenerys marched into King's Landing, flanked by Unsullied and with 2 dragons overhead, the city capitulated almost at once. The bells tolled, reminiscent of when Robert Baratheon once seized the city. Tommen was quietly taken into custody, protected by Margaery's family, hoping to avoid the fate of so many dethroned rulers. Cersei, faced with no options, tried to flee. Accounts vary on how she met her end. Some say she used wildfire to take her own life, and many others claim she was captured and exiled. But the annals are not clear, but either way, House Lannister fell from power. Daenerys took the Iron Throne in a ceremony that was both triumphant and subdued, given the threat still looming in the north. Robb stood at her side, representing the north and the Riverlands. The city's populace, half-starved from war and uncertain about their new queen, watched with weary hope. It was said that day that Daenerys refused to seat herself fully on the throne until she had traveled north with her dragons, that she might see the wall and judge the threat for herself. True to her word, Daenerys prepared her armies to march. The Tyrells pledged men and food to the cause, as did many other houses that had bent the knee. A grand muster formed outside King's Landing, the largest the realm had seen since the early days of Robert's rebellion. Robb, though overshadowed in numbers by the southern armies, led the northern contingents with pride. He received new ranks of recruits from the Stormlands, men who had no love for the Lannisters. The days of squabbling seemed to fade, replaced by the urgent knowledge that the real war was about to begin. They marched north in a massive column, a strange sight indeed, unsullied in orderly blocks, Dothraki horsemen galloping across the fields, knights of the Reach in shining armor, battered northern bannermen with their thick furs, and even freedmen from Essos who had followed Daenerys across the narrow sea. The roads could barely contain the throng. Small folk gawked. Some hailed them as saviors, others feared them as conquerors. But all recognized that something new was coming. When they crossed the neck, passing Moat Cailin, Robb greeted Howland Reed with a quiet smile. He introduced Daenerys to the Crannogman, who eyed her dragons with a mix of awe and wariness. From there, the host split into multiple routes to avoid starving the land. As they neared Winterfell, Daenerys beheld the snowy fields, the half-rebuilt towers of the castle, the starkness of the north. She also felt the biting cold that signaled true winter. Then came the ravens from the wall, desperate pleas for aid. The White Walkers were moving, an unholy chill sweeping the northern plains. Robb, Daenerys, and their combined councils gathered in Winterfell's great hall, a swirl of sigils, Targaryen dragons, Stark Direwolves, Tyrell roses, Martell sunspears, banners of lesser houses. The plan was set, a unified stand at the wall with the dragons as their greatest weapon. Stannis, hearing of this immense host, swallowed his pride and agreed to join them at Castle Black. The Night's Watch opened the gates, wide-eyed at the sight of dragons and thousands upon thousands of soldiers marching up the King's Road. Thus began the final push into the far north, culminating in a confrontation that would shape the destiny of Westeros for a generation. Writers and singers would later call it the Dawn War. They would speak of how the young wolf, once thought dead at the Red Wedding, rose to claim not just the North, but a place beside the Dragon Queen. They would speak of how dragons lit the skies above the Wall, and how White Walkers advanced in eerie silence across an endless expanse of snow. They would spin tales of knights and free folk fighting side by side, of Stannis Baratheon's flinty resolve, of the Tyrell bannermen forging alliances with wildlings, of dire wolves clashing with ice spiders in the frigid night. In that final battle, it was said, Daenerys circled on Drogon above the battlefield, unleashing gouts of dragon flame that turned hundreds of whites to ash. Jon Snow led the Night's Watch in a desperate defense at the ice fords, wielding a Valyrian steel sword that shone with ghostly light. Robb Stark and Grey Wind fought in tandem, carving a path through undead ranks, the direwolf snarls echoing across the tundra. At one crucial moment, a White Walker advanced on Robb, iceblade gleaming. They clashed in a spray of frost and shattered steel. Robb's sword, a new forged Valyrian steel blade gifted to him by Daenerys in recognition of their alliance, held firm, and with a mighty blow, he broke the Walker into shards of ice. But it was not an easy victory. The dead nearly overwhelmed them. The ground was slick with blood and shards of ice. Men died by the hundreds. Daenerys' dragons risked falling to the onslaught of cold magic, each pass in the sky a risk of icy spears hurled from the White Walkers below. The living forces were pushed to the brink, and only a final coordinated surge, led by Jon Snow, Robb Stark, and Daenerys herself, managed to shatter the White Walkers' ancient power, banishing them back into legend. When the dawn finally broke, tinted pink and gold over a battlefield of snow and ash, the survivors stood in exhausted silence. The undead threat was ended, at least for this age. The North was scarred by the conflict, villages destroyed, many heroes lost. But life remained. Humanity remained. The war for the Dawn was won. In the aftermath, as the realm tried to heal, Daenerys took her seat on the Iron Throne in King's Landing, recognized as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. But her first act was to proclaim new rights of independence for the North and the Riverlands, acknowledging Robb Stark as warden and king of those territories under a shared realm. There were formal words for it. Some called it a dual monarchy. Others referred to it as the New Compact. Yet in the songs, they said that Robb Stark was the High King of Westeros in all but name, sharing the rule with Daenerys Targaryen as the realm's chosen queen. The old feuds and titles meant less now, overshadowed by the knowledge that the living had nearly lost everything. Cersei Lannister was never seen again. Some said she had perished in King's Landing during the coup, others that she fled west to Casterly Rock and lived her remaining days in bitterness. Tommen was treated kindly, allowed a quiet life away from the throne. Tyrion Lannister, for his part, emerged from hiding to accept a place on Daenerys' council, though tension with Robb remained. Stannis, wounded but alive, retreated to the Stormlands, where he tried to rebuild his seat of power without contesting Daenerys' claim any further. The Greyjoys accepted autonomy in the Iron Islands, though they chafed at certain conditions about raiding. Dorne retained its ancient privileges, satisfied that at last the Lannisters no longer held sway. The Vale, having seen the threat from the North made real, pledged loyalty to the new order. Baelish, cunning as ever, attempted to insert himself into the new regime, but the mistrust toward him was too deep. In time, he met his downfall when Sansa Stark was eventually rescued and revealed his manipulations. And what of Robb Stark, the young wolf, the man who had survived death under the Frey's knives? The songs claim he bore that scar for the rest of his days, a reminder of how fragile life could be. He returned often to the north, to the halls of Winterfell, which he restored fully with the aid of his mother, who remained at River Run, and the surviving Stark loyalists. Grey Wind stayed close until old age claimed the direwolf. Some ballads say the king in the north wept like a child at the beast's funeral pyre, a final farewell to the companion who had been his guardian angel. But he lived on, guiding the realm in uneasy partnership with Daenerys Targaryen. She ruled from King's Landing, forging alliances and enacting reforms, while Robb oversaw the North and the Riverlands. Some said the two of them possessed a friendship, or perhaps more than that, tempered by the fires of war and the ice of the long night. Their bond became the cornerstone of a united Westeros, a realm that still remembered how close it had come to extinction. In time, the bard's songs would grow romantic and fanciful. They'd call it the Age of the Wolf and Dragon, a time of rebuilding and vigilance. They would tell of how, when the snows melted and the crops returned, the North soared to new prosperity, and the small folk across Westeros breathed more easily under a queen who had known slavery's horror, and a king who had known betrayal's bite. They would sing of how, in the darkest hour, the young wolf and the dragon queen set aside pride and tradition to forge a new path. They would sing of the great council that followed, in which the lords of Westeros recognized the new order and swore to hold the realm together, lest the horrors of the long night return. And when children asked their grandsires if it was true that Robb Stark was once slain at a wedding feast and rose again, the old men would chuckle and say, "He was the young wolf, child." The old gods watch over the Starks. Some say he died. Some say he merely slipped the noose. But either way, he came back to us in our hour of greatest need. Mend. So it was that Robb Stark, the boy king who might have perished on the floor of the twins, rose to stand among the greatest figures in Westerosi history. He became the High King in spirit, if not in formal title, beloved in the North, respected in the Riverlands, and grudgingly acknowledged across the rest of the realm. Whenever the snows fell thick and the nights grew cold, people looked north and remembered that the Starks had not forsaken them. For though winter would come again, and though new perils might arise, the memory of the wolf and the dragon, uniting to save Westeros, shone like a beacon against the darkness of the long night. Robb Stark woke before dawn in the quiet hush of Winterfell's keep, listening to the wind murmur against the newly rebuilt wall. The tower windows were covered with panes of bubbled glass, rare enough in the north, that rattled faintly with each icy gust. The winter snows had melted away these last few months, giving a brief glimpse of the north's green fields, but the night air still carried the sting of cold. He lay there in his chambers, feeling Grey Wind's absence more keenly than ever. His old friend, that massive direwolf who had once guarded him and led him to victory after victory, was gone. Robb had buried the wolf's bones in the Winterfell godswood after the final battle against the White Walkers. He had thought perhaps the old gods would watch over Grey Wind there, beneath those silent heart trees. Still, he often woke, expecting the direwolf's familiar huff in the darkness, or the shape of his ears silhouetted against the moonlight. He rose from bed, aware of the dull ache in his sword arm, the old wound in his side, the jagged scar he'd earned at the Red Wedding, still tugged when he twisted his torso, a stubborn reminder of that night of betrayal. That scar would always be with him, just as the memory of Grey Wind would always linger on the edges of his vision. He sometimes dreamed of the direwolf prowling Winterfell's corridors, silent and watchful. But for now, he was alone, king in the North in name, though he served side by side with Daenerys Targaryen, queen of the Seven Kingdoms, who had kept her promise to respect northern autonomy. He dressed quietly, pulling on the plain tunic of dark gray wool, embroidered with the wolf's head of Stark over the heart. He eschewed fancy velvets or southern silks, preferring the simple practicality of the North. Over it, he buckled a belt and dagger, then pulled on a heavier cloak lined with fur. The mornings were still chill enough to justify it. The corridor beyond his chamber opened onto a spiral stair that descended into the great keep. The stones felt cold underfoot. Torches in iron sconces guttered, leaving flickers of orange along the walls. And though the keep had been rebuilt after the ravages of war, the scent of charred timbers still seemed to linger in the deeper cracks. Only a pair of guards in Stark livery stood at attention near the door, men from House Serwyn if Robb recalled correctly. They bowed their heads as soon as they saw him, murmuring a soft, "Your Grace." He returned the gesture, always uneasy with the title. He'd been called Your Grace since the day his bannermen first raised him as king in the North, but time and war had shaped him into something else. Some said he was more than a king, less than a king, that in forging an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen, he had become something like a second ruler of the realm, half High King, half Warden of the North. Most simply called him the Young Wolf still. None of them saw the lines of weariness he felt etched under his eyes. He stepped outside into the early dawn gloom. Clouds of pale lavender and gray smudged the horizon. The courtyard smelled of damp earth and the tang of straw from the stables. Masons were already at work on a newly expanded granary near the outer wall. The ring of hammers on stone filled the air with a brisk rhythm. Across the yard, he saw the flicker of candlelight in the maester's tower, where ravens would be stirring in their loft. At that sight he thought of all the letters he had received these past weeks. Reports from King's Landing, from the Vale, from the Iron Islands. The realm was shifting in ways few had imagined possible just a handful of years ago. But the faint sense of home comforted him. The presence of his mother, Lady Catelyn Stark, also reassured him. She was in Winterfell again, having spent much time at Riverrun since the alliance with Daenerys ended the Lannisters' hold over the Riverlands. Catelyn had wanted to see her family's ancestral lands restored. She had coaxed farmland back to life, aided the small folk who had suffered for too long. But in recent moons, she had returned to Winterfell, believing her place was beside her only living son. She wanted to see the new North take shape. Robb crossed the yard, nodding to the soldiers who were stirring awake, and ducked into the great hall. The interior smelled of old soot, mead, and lingering smoke from last night's hearth fires. A few men were there already, sopping up trenchers of oat porridge. The clatter of wooden bowls mingled with quiet talk of winter storms that might still come roaring down from the lands of always winter. But as soon as they noticed him, they stiffened and rose, bowing in respect. He offered a quick, gruff greeting. A separate chamber to the side served as a smaller council room, a place for private meetings. He found it empty and dim. He took a seat on a plain wooden chair near the table, resting his chin on his hand, eyes unfocused for a moment. Sometimes, in that hush, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. Surviving the twins, rallying the North, forging a precarious alliance with Daenerys, fighting the White Walkers beyond the wall, losing Grey Wind in the last throes of that final battle. He exhaled softly, remembering the flash of ice against steel, the blue glow in the eyes of the undead. It felt unreal, as though it happened to someone else a century ago. And yet the faint twinge in his side reminded him otherwise. It was not long before the door opened, revealing his mother, Lady Catelyn. She wore a deep green gown trimmed with fur, her once reddish hair streaked with gray. Though lines of sorrow and age touched her face, she carried herself with composed grace. Robb saw in her eyes the memory of all they had lost: his father, Ned, her two younger sons, Bran and Rickon, who had vanished years ago, their fates uncertain, and Sansa, still somewhere in the Vale under the so-called protection of Petyr Baelish. Only Arya's fate had turned from rumor to cautious joy, since the Blackfish wrote that a girl traveling with Sandor Clegane had once come to Riverrun's gates, calling herself Arya Stark. No one quite knew where she might be now. But at least she was alive, or so the rumor went. Catelyn sat beside him. "You're up early, my son. Couldn't sleep?" "Monsieur Missari." "Epine." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've slept enough these last days. My dreams were heavy. I was remembering." He did not elaborate. She knew enough of his nightmares. "And I expect news from King's Landing soon." She nodded. Her expression grew weary, but determined. "Of Daenerys' royal progress to the Westerlands, you mean? Or has something else come up?" "Both. The Westerlands have been in turmoil since the downfall of House Lannister. Plenty of minor lords scrabbling for power. There are also whispers that Jaime Lannister, who was once captured by my men, has parted ways with King's Landing, seeking a quiet life. Some say he wanders the edges of the Trident, riddled with guilt. Others believe he's gone back to Casterly Rock to help keep the peace. It's all rumors, conflicting and uncertain." "There." Catelyn pressed her lips together. "It's strange to think the realm has moved on so quickly from the Lannister grip. Years of war, so many dead, and now we hear Lannister and merely shrug. But the aftermath is never so simple." "Mandaratni." "No," Robb said softly, rubbing the scar at his side. The war opened wounds in the realm that may never fully heal. And yet, the threat from beyond the wall taught many lords a harsh lesson in unity. I've seen that if we keep squabbling, something worse could overtake us all. That something worse was banished, was it not? She asked, meaning the White Walkers. For now, Robb murmured. Though the long night ended, the cold is always out there. We must remain vigilant. Joan's letters keep saying the Night's Watch is rebuilding, that new recruits trickle in, but not enough. He wants the realm to remember. And so do I. Dubbenwund. Catelyn's eyes flickered with discomfort at the name of Jon Snow. She had come a long way from her old resentment, but it was still a delicate matter. He is doing his duty then, she said. More than that, he's leading them. I want to ride to the wall soon to see him. It's been too long. Robb paused, measuring his words. But first, the realm calls. He saw her nod in understanding, though sadness crept into her gaze at the mention of all the demands laid upon him. They both looked up at a rap on the doorframe. The Blackfish, Brynden Tully, stood there, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, face set in a stern expression. Beside him was Wyman Manderly, his considerable girth wrapped in a heavy cloak. Manderly's bright eyes were shrewd even at this early hour, and he inclined his head politely. The two men greeted them and joined them at the table. Robb beckoned a servant to bring them mulled wine or mead. As soon as they settled, Manderly sighed. Your Grace, we've had a new raven from White Harbor. It seems a handful of ironborn reavers tried to raid the coast near the Bight, harassing fisherfolk and capturing a small merchant vessel. My own men responded quickly, but they escaped. There are always more of those damned ironborn about, testing the waters. Robb frowned. We've tried forging an understanding with the Iron Islands, but Euron Greyjoy's ascension there is complicated. He's no better than Balon was. The man's rumored to be mad, dabbling in dark arts, and sailing the seas with some monstrous crew. The agreement we hammered out was with certain captains, not Euron. If he's now the power on Pike, that changes matters. Memorandum. Blackfish drummed his fingers on the table. We may need to dispatch more ships to guard the coast. If the Manderleys are not enough, perhaps we can coordinate with Daenerys' fleets now that she controls a portion of the Royal Navy. Though how quickly her lords would respond is another question. Manderly harumphed. We can't wait on the Queen's generosity. White Harbor will do its duty, but the seas are wide, and the Ironborn slippery. We need a more lasting solution if Euron refuses to abide by the new order. Bannon. Robb exhaled. Let's keep the conversation about the Iron Islands open. I'll write to Lady Alannis Harlaw, or to any reasonable captain who might broker a truce. In the meantime, yes, I want more patrols in the Bight. We'll see if Daenerys can spare a few ships from Dragonstone. Perhaps the Tyrells, who fancy themselves lords of the sea these days, could help if the Queen commands it. Nodder. They spoke for a while longer about the practicalities, from financing additional ships to how best to supply them. Eventually, the talk shifted to a pressing matter that had haunted the North for some time. The disappearance of Arya Stark, the uncertain whereabouts of Sansa, and the question of how House Stark's lineage would endure. The Blackfish coughed into his fist, exchanging a glance with Catelyn. Robb recognized that look. It was the same one that said, "We worry for the future." Brynden Tully spoke first. Word from the Vale is still muddled, but it seems Petyr Baelish has lost some measure of power. Young Lord Robin Arryn came of age, and the lords of the Vale forced Baelish's departure. Where he's gone, no one knows. Possibly across the narrow sea, possibly lurking in the Riverlands. In the chaos, Sansa might have slipped away, or might still be concealed under some assumed name. If so, she's too clever to reveal herself without cause. Catelyn's mouth tightened. I pray each day that she finds a way home. My poor girls. If only I had known the fates that awaited them. Sansa, lost in the Vale, and Arya, last rumored to be wandering the Trident with the Hound. She sighed. Is that truly her life now? Hiding behind a scarred sellsword? Manderly scratched his thick beard. Some men say they saw Sandor Clegane crossing into the Westerlands. Others claim he died near the salt pans. It's near impossible to know. But if your daughter still travels with him, Perhaps she's safer than she'd be alone. The roads are uncertain, though not as dangerous as they were in the height of the war. Matis. Robb closed his eyes briefly. If we could only gather them all, but I can't spare the men to scour the realm searching. The alliances we've built are fragile. Still, I'll send out fresh ravens to every major seat, urging that if they find any sign of Arya or Sansa, they send word, and I'll continue negotiations with the Vale to see if we can glean more about Sansa's whereabouts. Catelyn's voice trembled a bit. We cannot abandon them. They're Starks, and we've lost so many already. We. No one's giving up, Mother, Robb murmured gently. But we must proceed carefully. We can't show desperation. That only invites opportunists who might claim false leads for gold. We'll do this the right way. The door opened again, and a young steward hurried in, breathing heavily. Pardon, Your Grace, my lords, my lady. There's a raven from King's Landing. We thought you'd want to see it at once. He handed Robb a sealed parchment, the wax bearing the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Robb's stomach tensed. He broke the seal, scanning the letter. Daenerys' words were precise, penned by the new royal scribe. The queen was concluding her progress in the Westerlands after pacifying a handful of rebellious lords near Casterly Rock. She intended to head northward before winter's snows returned in full, to meet with Robb once again in Winterfell. If the roads allowed, she would bring several of her chief advisors, possibly including Tyrion Lannister, now serving as her hand. She requested that the North prepare for her arrival in the coming moon's turn. Robb let out a slow exhale. She's coming here. He glanced at his mother and the other two. Daenerys is returning to the North, possibly with Tyrion Lannister in tow. Manderly's face flickered with distaste at the mention of that name. A Lannister, even if he's the Queen's hand. That'll raise hackles. Robb shrugged. It may raise them, but Tyrion has proven a valuable negotiator. He was the one who hammered out the terms that gave the Riverlands partial independence under our rule. And from all accounts, he's been loyal to Daenerys. Catelyn frowned thoughtfully. The small folk may not take kindly to his presence, though perhaps they'll mind less so long as winter supplies continue to flow. Where do you plan to host them? Winterfell can accommodate a queen and her retinue, but your father always believed in welcoming guests with generosity, especially those who bring peace. That tradition stands, Robb said. However, I won't repeat the mistake I made at the Twins. Security will be ironclad, and will ensure that there are enough witnesses to discourage any form of betrayal, though I doubt betrayal is her aim. We are allies, after all. And this alliance shaped the realm as it stands today. He could see they all understood. Even though the White Walkers had been defeated, and the Iron Throne was now Daenerys, the memory of broken guest rights would never leave him. He would host Daenerys Targaryen and her retinue with courtesy, but also with caution. No matter how much trust they had built, ghosts of the past lingered. They talked a while longer about the logistics. Where to house the Queen's men, how to store enough provisions, which lords to invite to the feasts. Eventually, as the sky brightened outside, Catelyn rose to tend to her tasks, while Manderly and the Blackfish went to finalize plans for patrol routes. Robb lingered behind, swallowing the last of his mead. His mind roiled with new concerns. The Queen's visit, Sansa and Arya's fates, the Ironborn raids, the future of the North under the Targaryen crown. So much had changed in such little time, and he had changed with it. He rubbed his thumb over the table's grain, feeling the old wood ridges under his skin. I'll do what I must, he murmured, as though speaking to an invisible presence. Sometimes, he liked to believe Grey Wind heard him still, or that the old gods were listening through the heart tree. Then he stood and stepped outside into the full light of morning. Days passed, and ravens flew to and fro. The news spread quickly through the north. The Dragon Queen was coming, and she traveled with a retinue of knights, advisors, and possibly even 1 or 2 dragons. Some said she would bring Drogon, the largest of her 3, though rumor claimed the creature had grown temperamental. Others believed only her smaller dragons accompanied her, as Drogon roamed the skies more freely, untethered to men's commands. Whatever the truth, the small folk whispered with a mix of awe and dread at the notion of dragons visiting Winterfell. How would the beasts fare in the colder climes of the north? Would they scorch the farmland? Would they appear as winged protectors or harbingers of doom? No one truly knew. Robb tried to keep the realm calm by sending messages to his bannermen, reminding them that House Targaryen and House Stark were allies, that these dragons had fought in the war against the others and done great deeds. But the suspicion was not easily quelled. The North had always been wary of dragons since Aegon's conquest. Still, times were different now. The old hatred that once flared in men's hearts towards southern kings had softened in the face of the undead threat they had all witnessed. If Daenerys meant no harm, most folk would treat her with respect, if only out of gratitude that she hadn't let the entire realm freeze in eternal night. Preparations went on at Winterfell. Tapestries were hung in the great hall, fires were stoked. The kitchens bustled with huntsmen, bringing in fresh game, salted meats, barrels of pickled vegetables. Lady Catelyn oversaw the arrangement of rooms in the keep, ensuring the queen and her highest advisors would have the best chambers, while the lesser lords could be housed in newly rebuilt wings. The stables had to be expanded to accommodate so many visiting horses, and Manderley's men coordinated with the blacksmiths to ensure enough fodder was on hand. Amid that flurry of activity, a fresh wave of rumors arrived from the south. Word trickled up the King's Road that Euron Greyjoy had attacked several Lannister ships off Fair Isle, claiming them in the name of the drowned god. Some whispered he had designs on the mainland. Others said he was courting the newly widowed Cersei Lannister. Rumors were so outlandish that Robb hardly knew what to believe. Yet Euron was unpredictable and dangerous. The moment he smelled weakness, he would pounce. Robb wrote to Daenerys, urging vigilance on the seas, but the Raven had already flown. Now all he could do was wait for her arrival. It was a crisp morning when the first outriders arrived, announcing that the Queen's vanguard was mere days away. Robb took a handful of his men, a mixture of Stark, Reed, and Mormont bannermen, and rode out to meet them on the last stretch of the King's Road before it branched off to approach Winterfell. The riders thundered across fields that were still tinged gold in the autumn sun, though winter's breath lingered in the shadows. The men wore cloaks of gray and white, the Stark sigil fluttering in the breeze. Robb himself rode a tall copper bay courser, carrying his father's sword at his hip. The Valyrian steel blade Daenerys had gifted him after the war, he had named Wolf's Fang, though he still sometimes missed the simpler steel he had carried in youth. But Wolf's Fang was lighter, sharper, and reminded him of how everything had changed. They rode for a day and a half, camping beneath the open sky. Each night, Robb gazed into the dimming embers of the campfire, thinking how many times he had done just this, led men along the roads of the north, uncertain what new dawn would bring. And each time, he felt Grey Wind's absence as though it were a phantom limb. The direwolf used to curl at his side, warding off the night's chill and any threat that dared approach. Now all Robb had was memory. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be. On the second day, the outriders spotted the Queen's party across a broad, open plain. Robb guided his men to a small rise, scanning the horizon. He saw banners in the distance. The three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, a pale silver and black standard flapping in the breeze. Alongside it flew banners of the Tyrell Rose, the Martell Sun and Spear, the sigil of House Greyjoy's Kraken, though that, presumably, was from a defector or an allied captain, not from Euron's line. Dozens of smaller banners fluttered, representing houses that had joined Daenerys' cause. And beyond all that, in the pale morning light, Robb caught a glimpse of something large and dark flying overhead. His heart clenched. Yes, there was no mistaking that silhouette. A dragon. Not the biggest of Daenerys' brood, but large enough to make men quail. Its wings beat heavily, sending gusts of wind across the field. The men at the head of the marching column gave it plenty of space, looking up warily as it passed overhead. Robb steeled himself and rode forward. His men followed in a tight formation. Soon, the Queen's outriders spotted them and waved them down. Robb reined in his horse just as Daenerys Targaryen emerged from the column, flanked by unsullied guards and two knights in shining plate. She wore riding leathers of black and burgundy, a cloak that framed her pale hair, and gloves that gleamed with threads of silver. A pair of small dragons soared above her, their screeches like high flutes in the wind. Robb remembered from the war how one of them had circled overhead when the White Walkers advanced, flaming the undead below. The sight still raised gooseflesh on his arms. Daenerys dismounted gracefully, handing her reins to one of the Unsullied. Her violet eyes found Robb, and a smile touched her lips, though it held a hint of reserve. "King Robb Stark," she said in a clear, carrying voice. "We meet again at last, under more peaceful skies." He swung down from his horse and bowed his head. "Your Grace, welcome to the north." She strode forward, and Robb met her halfway. They clasped hands in greeting. The men around them watched with a hush that belied their mutual histories, battlefields, negotiations, the forging of a realm. She looked far more regal than the last time he had seen her, in the battered fields beyond the wall. There, she had been haggard from the cold and the horrors of war. Now, she appeared every inch the queen, composed and strong, though lines of weariness showed near her eyes. They exchanged courtesies. Tyrion Lannister rode up, perched on a black destrier too large for him, but he handled it with surprising ease. The dwarf slid off and gave Robb a respectful nod, though a slight smirk curved his lips. "Your Grace, how delightful to breathe the northern air again, sharp enough to cut a man's lungs. I see your roads are in better shape than the last time I ventured north." Robb inclined his head. "Lord Tyrion, you're welcome, so long as you respect our lands. I trust you found the journey passable." Tyrion glanced at the long train of men and wagons behind him. "As passable as any in Westeros. At least we weren't forced to hack through undead hordes this time. I count that an improvement." They both shared a quiet, knowing look, recalling the monstrous war they had faced side by side. Then Daenerys introduced some of her companions. Sir Davos Seaworth stood behind them, looking weathered as always, though he was not as out of place in the north, given his time with Stannis Baratheon. Ser Jorah Mormont was also present, though the man kept a respectful distance, uncertain of how he'd be received by northerners after his past disgraces. Robb acknowledged him with a nod, remembering that Jorah's father, Jeor Mormont, had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Beyond them stood Grey Worm, commander of the Unsullied, expression impassive. A handful of Dornish lords were there too, as well as representatives from the Reach. The retinue was large, befitting a queen's progress. They traveled together the rest of the way to Winterfell. The roads were well maintained, patrolled by Stark men on horseback. Villagers emerged from huts and small crofters' cottages to gape at the passing column. Some knelt, others waved timidly. The dragons overhead evoked awe and a bit of fear. Robb kept pace near Daenerys, occasionally pointing out a landmark or telling her bits of northern lore. Tyrion listened keenly, sometimes interjecting witty remarks. Daenerys asked after the farmland, the new irrigation channels that had been built, the local trades. She seemed determined to understand the North's culture, to treat it as part of her realm, but also distinct in accordance with the terms of their alliance. By midday, they saw Winterfell's rebuilt towers rising in the distance, their gray stone glinting in weak sunlight. Steam curled from the hot springs that ran through the castle's walls, creating a haze that drifted across the ramparts. Daenerys reined in her horse for a moment, taking in the sight. "It looks stronger than I remember," she said quietly. "Those walls have grown, or perhaps my memory's failing me." Robb nodded. "We've rebuilt as best we could. New stone, new towers. The hot springs remain, of course. One of Winterfell's blessings. You'll see the improvements inside as well." When they reached the gates, the fortress guards parted, and the wide courtyard filled with men and women in Stark and Targaryen colors. Up on the walls, horns sounded in greeting. The men of House Mormont, House Serwyn, House Glover, and others looked on, offering respectful bows or nods. The crowd parted, and Lady Catelyn Stark stood at the forefront, flanked by Brynden Tully, Wyman Manderly, and a handful of other northern lords. Catelyn wore a dignified gown of dark blue embroidered with the Stark direwolf and Tully fish, her hair bound in a thick braid shot with silver. She curtsied deeply to Daenerys, then rose to embrace Robb. Daenerys dismounted. A hush fell over the yard. Robb saw the eyes of the northern onlookers flick to the dragons overhead, to the Unsullied with their tall spears, and then to the queen herself. At length, Catelyn stepped forward and inclined her head. "Your Grace, on behalf of House Stark, I welcome you to Winterfell. May you find warmth and comfort within our walls, and may the old gods and the new smile upon this meeting." Daenerys accepted the greeting, a gracious smile on her lips. She thanked Catelyn, adding a formal acknowledgement of the North's sovereignty under the new arrangement. Tension seemed to break, replaced by cautious optimism. The Queen had come in peace after all, and with no sign of scorn or arrogance. The crowd began to talk softly among themselves, nodding approval. Servants hurried to help stable the horses, unload supplies, and set up accommodations. The Unsullied formed an orderly column, while some of the Queen's knights peeled off to the guest wing. Daenerys was shown to a suite of rooms in the Great Keep, those same rooms once reserved for the Starks' highest guests. Robb and Catelyn accompanied her, ensuring all was suitable. A massive hearth crackled with fire. Tapestries depicting direwolves in forest glades hung on the walls, and a table near the window overlooked the courtyard. The chill air seeped in around the edges of the old stone, but the brazier and hearth kept it at bay. Daenerys shed her cloak and gloves, smoothing back a stray lock of silver hair. "I thank you for the hospitality. This is quite different from King's Landing's climate, but I appreciate the warmth." Her gaze lingered on Robb, then flicked to Catelyn. "I hope to rest briefly, then perhaps we can meet for a meal and begin our discussions. There is much to speak of." Robb nodded. "Indeed there is. I'll have a servant bring hot mulled wine and anything else you might need. We'll gather in the Great Hall at midday to share a feast in your honor." "That's so." He hesitated, feeling a swirl of conflicting memories. The last time they had shared a great feast in a hall full of lords, it had led to the Red Wedding. But that horror was Walder Frey's doing. This was Winterfell, and he was no Walder Frey. He would uphold guest right with his life. Still, the memory of that betrayal gnawed at him, a constant reminder to stay vigilant. Daenerys must have sensed his unease, for her expression softened. She touched his arm lightly, just a brief gesture. "We've both witnessed the worst betrayals and the highest loyalties, Your Grace. Let us hope this meeting is remembered for its good omens, not the tragedies of the past." Robb inclined his head. "Agreed. I'll leave you to rest. Until midday, Your Grace." He and Catelyn withdrew, leaving Daenerys to the company of her handmaidens and a pair of unsullied guards. As they made their way through the corridor, Catelyn exhaled slowly. "She seems approachable, different from the stories I once heard of Targaryen madness." "She's proven herself many times," Robb replied. "But let's not forget she can be ruthless when needed. It's part of why she survived." Catelyn's gaze flickered. "And you've been ruthless as well, though you try to hide it. The Red Wedding changed you. The battles beyond the wall changed you. You must both weigh your pasts carefully if we're to steer the realm forward." Robb grimaced faintly, but he knew she was right. He had once been a boy who never thought to question a man's honor if he broke bread under one roof. Now, he was a survivor who triple-checked every corner for hidden daggers. That was the price of living when so many had died. At midday, the great hall of Winterfell bustled with life, crackling fireplaces at each end, and long tables laden with trenchers of venison stew, roasted turnips, fresh loaves of bread, honeyed carrots, salted fish, and spiced wine. Northern drummers and pipers played softly. Targaryen banners had been hung alongside Stark ones, symbolizing the unity they had forged. A seat at the high table was reserved for Daenerys, with Robb to her right and Tyrion Lannister to her left. Catelyn sat further down, near Manderly and the Blackfish, while others arrayed themselves by rank and station. Daenerys entered in a gown of silver gray with subtle red accents. Men rose to greet her. She took her seat with poise, surveying the hall. Robb caught her gaze, nodding in courtesy. He stood and lifted a goblet of mead. "To Queen Daenerys of House Targaryen, whose arrival we celebrate, Winterfell welcomes you and your retinue. May our alliance continue to bring peace to the realm." A chorus of cheers rose. Daenerys dipped her head in acknowledgement, then lifted her own goblet. "To the north, and to King Robb of House Stark, whose valiant efforts saved countless lives in our war against the darkness beyond the wall. May our unity remain unbroken." More cheers, hearty and booming. Tyrion smirked, tapping his fingers on the table in an almost bored applause, though his eyes were keen. Ser Jorah, seated near the end of the dais, looked stoic, while Sir Davos offered a warm nod of approval. The feast began in earnest. Servants circulated with ewers of mead and ale, platters of steaming food. Between courses, Daenerys spoke softly with Robb about her time in the Westerlands. She described dealing with rebellious houses that had once sworn to the Lannisters, how she had tried to temper mercy with firmness. Robb listened carefully, offering suggestions on how they might quell further uprisings without turning the region into a scorched ruin. Tyrion joined the conversation, referencing the gold mines that had once filled the Lannisters' coffers, now mostly exhausted. They discussed the importance of trade routes and tax policies, which made for an unlikely topic at a feast, but it was the realm's reality now. War was no longer the only concern. Rebuilding was. As the meal continued, the Queen also asked after the night the others were defeated. She spoke in hushed tones, mindful that many in the hall had lost dear friends in that battle. "I still see them in my dreams sometimes," she confessed, voice subdued. Those cold blue eyes, the unstoppable march. Fire can only do so much. Even Drogon, I feared for him. Robb nodded slowly. "You weren't alone in that fear. We all thought the realm might die that night. If not for you and your dragons, and for the swords of the living gathered as one, I doubt we would be feasting today." Tyrion sipped his wine, eyes distant. "It remains the single greatest unifying moment in the history of Westeros. Perhaps we should keep the memory alive. People are quick to forget the terror once it's gone." "That memory drives the Night's Watch to keep vigilant," Robb said. "And I'll do what I can to remind the North. But men tire of fear. They want comfort, certainty. They want to believe such nightmares are gone forever." "They might be for our lifetimes at least," Daenerys said, though she sounded uncertain. "But I've learned not to discount the darker tales. The world is vast, and magic courses through its veins. We must remain watchful." Conversation turned then to other matters. A group of northern lords approached to greet the Queen, carefully measured in their words. She responded with polite interest, praising their region's fortitude during the war. One younger lord named Little from the mountains muttered that he had once seen a white tear a man's arm off. Daenerys listened gravely, acknowledging the horror. Then she steered the conversation to how their clan was faring post-war, offering a modest grant of royal funds for the rebuilding of roads if they so needed. The clan lord blinked in surprise, then bowed gratefully. Robb felt a stirring of hope. This was how the realm should be governed, with an eye to practical needs, not just showy gestures. After the feast, the Queen and Robb retreated to a smaller solar for a more private council. Tyrion, Davos, Manderly, and the Blackfish came as well, along with Grey Worm and a few other advisors. A warm brazier in the corner provided flickering light as the day began to wane. Daenerys took a seat near the fireplace, folding her hands. "So, now that we're all here, let us speak plainly of the challenges we face. The Seven Kingdoms may be at peace for now, but scattered rebellions and opportunists remain. Euron Greyjoy is a threat at sea. Some lords in the Stormlands still rally behind the memory of Stannis Baratheon, though I understand he has retreated to Storm's End. Meanwhile, the East grows restless. Merchants from Pentos and Volantis speak of new sellsword companies forming, perhaps eyeing Westeros in our weakened state. And the North, for all its resilience, must keep guard against anything that might stir beyond the wall." Tyrion nodded. "A thorough summary, Your Grace. The realm is large, with many cracks. Our resources are finite. We must decide where to focus first. I suggest dealing with Euron Greyjoy. He's the most immediate threat to trade and coastal settlements." "And Robb frowned. "Agreed. His raids near the Bight have already harried my people. If he's grown bold enough to attack near Fair Isle, It won't be long before he sets his sights on bigger targets. We must show him we won't tolerate it. Daenerys tapped her fingers against the arm of her chair. I could dispatch a portion of my navy, along with a dragon, to ensure he doesn't disrupt crucial shipping lanes. But I hesitate to send too much strength away while we still need a firm hand in King's Landing. Tyrion sighed. My sister's shadow lingers. Cersei's loyalists remain, though diminished. The city is mostly under our control, but trouble could flare if we appear distracted. It would be a prime moment for some cunning plot. Manderley cleared his throat. White Harbor stands ready to defend the eastern coast. If you'll supply a few war galleys from the royal fleet, together we could guard the sea lanes near the neck. That should deter Euron from pushing too far north. Sir Davos, quiet thus far, spoke in his low, gravelly voice. We can't ignore the Stormlands either. If Stannis remains a living symbol of a competing claim, some lords may cause mischief. I've known the man. He'll not forget his claim easily. Yet I also know he's lost much. He may be content to rebuild the Stormlands if given half a chance, but only if we're not heavy-handed in trying to subdue him. He respects strength tempered by fairness. Robb listened, remembering the tense negotiation he'd had with Stannis outside Winterfell, just before the final push against the others. They had come to an uneasy truce then. Stannis had lost so many men that pressing a new war was folly. If the man harbored hopes of the throne still, he hadn't acted on them overtly. Perhaps, as Davos said, he was content to nurse his pride in Storm's End, waiting. Or perhaps he was plotting something deeper. Robb inhaled. As for the north, we remain watchful. But the greatest threat is gone. Our scouts see no sign of whites or others. The Night's Watch is building new fortifications. Jon Snow's leadership has been crucial. He's forging alliances with the wildlings who settled south of the Wall. They're not all docile, but he's keeping them in line. They might be a valuable resource if handled properly. Daenerys arched a brow. Yes, your half-brother. I recall his role in convincing me to send the dragons north. One could argue he saved the realm. I wish the realm recognized it more formally. Robb shrugged. He's sworn to the Watch. They prefer anonymity and neutrality. That suits Jon's sense of honor, I think. Still, he's gained respect from many corners. Perhaps that's enough. They spent the next hour debating the distribution of forces, budgets, food stores, and what new edicts might be needed to keep the peace. At times, the discussion grew heated, as Tyrion and Manderley clashed on trade tariffs, or the Blackfish demanded more direct support to restore every corner of the Riverlands. Daenerys remained calm, listening, occasionally making decisions. Robb was reminded that while they shared power, she was the ultimate sovereign over the Seven Kingdoms, though the North retained a special status. It was a delicate balance. Yet Daenerys seemed determined to handle it without arrogance. By nightfall, they had hammered out a basic plan. The Royal Navy would dispatch a small fleet to White Harbor, commanded by a loyal admiral. The Targaryen forces in King's Landing would remain strong enough to deter rebellion, while a diplomatic mission would be sent to Storm's End to assess Stannis' intentions. Meanwhile, the North and the Riverlands could expect grants of royal funds to aid in reconstruction, in return for continuing to support the new realm's stability. All in all, it was a workable arrangement, if precarious. After the meeting adjourned, Daenerys lingered behind, gazing at the dying embers in the fireplace. Robb found himself alone with her, the others having gone off to their chambers or the great hall. Candlelight softened the angles of her face, casting half of it in shadow. She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite name. Perhaps a curious mix of relief and weariness. I never expected to feel this tired after winning a war, she said softly. I know the feeling, Robb replied. Sometimes I wonder if I was better suited to swinging a sword than carrying a crown. She gave a quiet laugh. I've thought that many times. In Essos, I was a conqueror or a liberator, always in motion. Now each day is a new puzzle of alliances, taxes, laws. My dragons are restless, and so am I. He nodded. You've done well by the realm, and by the North. Your help was vital when we faced the others. Without the dragons, we would have been overwhelmed. Her gaze lingered on him, and he sensed her question unspoken. And do you ever regret this alliance? Do you still doubt me, as so many Northerners once did? Robb met her eyes steadily. I don't regret forging this alliance. Our people needed it. Daenerys gave a slow exhale, then turned her attention back to the fireplace. We must keep it strong. The smallest crack can widen into a chasm. Cersei taught me that. The others taught me that, as well. Agreed. I won't let old grudges or southern politics tear it apart. She gave a half-smile. And if Euron tries to sow chaos, we'll show him what it means to cross the wolf and the dragon. Her eyes flashed with that fierce light he had seen once on the battlefield. Then the moment passed, and she looked tired again. Rest well, King Robb. We'll speak on the morrow. He inclined his head. Good night, Your Grace. As he left, the corridors felt strangely quiet, the hush of the keep pressing in. He wondered if Grey Wind would have felt uneasy with so many strangers around. Then he realized Grey Wind would have recognized Daenerys' scent. Maybe he would have treated her like an ally. The direwolf had always been an astute judge of friend and foe. Robb passed the door to the Godswood and paused, feeling an urge to step beneath the heart tree. The hour was late, but the pull of old gods and older memories was strong. He made his way inside, the swirling night air greeting him with a hush. Starlight filtered through the canopy. The face in the weirwood, carved long ago, regarded him with that timeless expression. Sorrow, acceptance, a ghostly watchfulness. He sank to his knees on the moss. His breath misted in the cold air. He let his mind wander, thinking of his father, Ned Stark, who had once prayed to these gods, who had died a prisoner in King's Landing. Thinking of his brothers, lost, scattered. Thinking of Grey Wind, whose bones now lay somewhere beneath these roots, in an unmarked patch of soil. A wave of guilt and gratitude and sorrow broke over him all at once, leaving him breathless. Father, he murmured, I have tried to do what's right, tried to keep the North safe, to honor our name. But I've had to make choices I never imagined. I've spilt blood, built alliances with Targaryens, accepted the help of men I once called enemies. I wish I knew if you would approve. Ma'am. The weirwood's face was silent, but the wind in the branches sighed softly, as though in sympathy. Robb closed his eyes, letting that gentle noise fill him. For a moment, he could almost sense a presence. Then it passed, and he was alone once more. Rising, he left the Godswood and returned to the keep, trying to shake off the melancholy. Tomorrow would bring more councils, more negotiations. Such was the life he had chosen, or the life fate had forced upon him, shaped by the Red Wedding's knives and the direwolf's faithful heart. Morning found them at another council session, this time focusing on the Iron Islands. The Queen's men were quick to confirm that Euron Greyjoy had claimed the Seastone chair by force, exiling or killing any who stood in his way. His captains now raided the coasts, causing mayhem. None of his siblings seemed able to curb his ambitions. Yara Greyjoy, who had once commanded a portion of the Iron Fleet, had vanished. Some said imprisoned, others said on the run. The Queen considered sending one of her dragons to assault Pike itself, but Tyrion cautioned that dragons over open water might be vulnerable if Euron had scorpions or other siege weapons hidden on his ships. They debated at length, though no perfect solution emerged. In the end, they resolved to send a small but elite fleet, commanded by the Queen's loyal admiral Quentin Velaryon, who would coordinate with House Manderly's ships out of White Harbor. Ser Davos, known for his maritime experience, volunteered to join them as an envoy. They would attempt to rally or bribe the Ironborn captains who hated Euron, while isolating those who supported him. Perhaps a well-placed dagger or two might remove Euron from power. Robb felt a twinge of unease at the mention of daggers and subterfuge, but he knew the realm could not afford a drawn-out war at sea. Sometimes, a single thrust behind the scenes saved 1,000 lives. Meanwhile, outside the castle, Daenerys' dragons continued to cause a stir. The smaller one, Rhaegal, perched atop the rebuilt eastern battlements, snapping at the crows that ventured too close. Folk who came and went from Winterfell's gates glanced up warily, half expecting the creature to bathe them in flames. The other, Viserion, seemed more docile, content to roost near the hot springs. Some people began calling him the steam dragon. A few adventurous souls tried to approach with offerings of meat, only to be met with indifference or a warning growl. For the most part, no incidents occurred. Daenerys had clearly trained them to obey her commands. Still, Robb had the guards on watch, remembering that these beasts, while allies, were far from tame. On the third day of Daenerys' visit, an unexpected raven arrived from the Vale. Its message, penned by Lord Grafton of Gulltown, stated that Sansa Stark had been seen at the gates of the moon, apparently free of Baelish's grasp. She had parted ways with Lord Robin Arryn, who had come of age, and was rumored to be traveling west in search of her family. However, the letter gave no exact route or timeline. The Vale was vast, and if she had disguised herself, tracking her would be no simple task. Catelyn clutched the parchment, tears brimming. "My little girl. She's finally free. We have to send men to find her, to bring her home." "Nysteven?" Robb gently placed a hand on his mother's shoulder. "We will. I'll dispatch a careful search party. Not too large. She might be frightened if she thinks we're an army. We'll send riders who know the Vale's roads." Daenerys, upon hearing the news, immediately offered to help. "The Vale still has knights loyal to me. I can arrange for them to keep watch. If they spot her, they can guide her north safely." Catelyn thanked her, gratitude shining through her tears. "If you help me find my daughter, Your Grace, I'll be in your debt." Daenerys waved that off. "Think nothing of it. The Starks have done enough for me. Besides, Sansa deserves to come home." So letters were written, sealed, and sent via swift couriers. Robb dispatched Smaljan Umber and a handful of trusted men to the eastern edges of the Vale, carrying messages for lords there. They were to proceed gently, asking after a high-born young woman traveling alone, or with a few companions, offering no threat. Robb's heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. If Sansa returned safely, it would be one piece of their shattered family restored. Only Arya remained unaccounted for, though rumors of her wandering the Riverlands persisted. The Hound had apparently parted from her at some point, or so said the stories. Robb prayed she too would find her way home someday. The North needed its scattered wolves. Even as hope stirred in the matter of Sansa, however, the tides of politics never ceased. One evening, in a smaller gathering, Daenerys asked Robb for his perspective on the future of House Stark. He realized she was politely inquiring whether he intended to wed and produce heirs. The North had rallied behind him, but succession was a thorny matter. If he died without issue, the Stark line might end, or pass to an unknown next of kin. Robb, caught off guard, hesitated. "I haven't given it much thought. The war's aftermath, the White Walkers. I suppose I should, if only for stability." Daenerys nodded. "Stability is crucial. Even if we prefer the battlefield to the marriage bed, the realm demands heirs. Many houses would be honored to align with House Stark." Catelyn gently chimed in. "She's right, Robb. Before the Red Wedding you were betrothed to a Frey, then you chose Talisa. And we know how that ended. The past is painful, but the future remains." He lowered his gaze. The memory of Talisa, his beloved wife, murdered at the Twins, stabbed him like a knife. She'd carried their unborn child, a hope for tomorrow stolen by Walder Frey's treachery. It still haunted him. "I can't replace her," he said softly. Catelyn's voice was gentle. "No one suggests you replace her, my son. But you can honor her memory by ensuring House Stark endures. The North needs it." He sighed. Even the talk of betrothals soured his mood, but he understood the logic. A realm without heirs spelled chaos. Among the houses that might be suitable, there were daughters of the Manderleys, the Tullys, the Glovers, and others. Even the Tyrells might propose an alliance, though that might complicate matters. He resolved to think on it, but not to act rashly. He couldn't force himself into a loveless marriage for politics' sake, or so he told himself. Daenerys seemed to grasp his reluctance. "Forgive me if this topic is painful. I only mention it because you've built something strong here. I don't want to see it undone by a quirk of succession. We Targaryens have too often relied on precarious lines of inheritance. Look where it led. Nifsu. Robb nodded. No apology needed. I understand. Let's put the matter aside for now, at least until we see the outcome with Sansa and whether any other living Starks might return. Another day brought more councils, more small feasts. Daenerys spent time touring the library, the training yard, even the forges. She took a keen interest in northern crafts, in the newly forged steel that local smiths were producing. Sometimes, she walked along the battlements to watch her dragons circling overhead. The small folk learned to accept the sight, though mothers still clutched their children closer when the shadows passed over the fields. Robb accompanied her often, showing her the improvements. He couldn't help admiring the determination in her posture, the curiosity in her questions. This was not the fiery conqueror of Essos alone. This was a ruler who wanted to understand every corner of her realm. He found himself respecting her more with each passing day. Whether that respect might grow into something else, he could not say. He felt the ghost of Talisa's memory rise in him whenever he looked at Daenerys. That guilt, that question. Is it too soon to admire another? So he pushed such thoughts away and kept their interactions cordial and rooted in matters of state. Tyrion, meanwhile, spent a good deal of time in Winterfell's library, poring over old manuscripts with an enthusiasm that baffled the northern scribes. Occasionally, he joined Robb for a meal or a walk, bantering about the differences between the North and King's Landing. Robb found himself grudgingly enjoying the dwarf's wit. Despite the name Lannister, Tyrion had proven at least partially honorable, enough to help hold the realm together. They avoided speaking of Ned Stark's death, or the Red Wedding, or any of the old wounds that might sour their fragile rapport. On the 7th day of Daenerys' stay, a messenger arrived, travel-stained, from the west. He carried news that Euron Greyjoy had indeed launched more raids, capturing a few merchant vessels. But the combined royal and Manderly fleet had responded swiftly, sinking 2 of Euron's raiding ships. Euron himself was not among the casualties, nor had his flagship been found. The search continued. Daenerys sighed in frustration. The Kraken slinks away again. I'd hoped for a quicker resolution. They pressed on, finalizing the decisions around that campaign. Soon after, letters came from the Stormlands. Stannis Baratheon had allowed a small royal delegation inside Storm's End, receiving them with cold courtesy. He insisted publicly that the Iron Throne was still his by right, yet he made no move to take up arms. His forces were meager, battered by the war, and by the final battle in the north. The consensus was that Stannis would not pose an immediate threat, though he might remain a thorn. Daenerys, satisfied that her presence in the north had resolved key matters of alliance and security, announced that she would depart in a few days to visit the Wall. She intended to pay homage to the Night's Watch, to see the site of the final stand against the others, and to greet Jon Snow if possible. Robb jumped at that, offering to ride with her. I'd like to see my brother, he said simply. Thus it was decided that a smaller retinue would journey northward from Winterfell, leaving Tyrion and some men behind to manage the day-to-day business. The roads to the Wall were not easy, especially with winter's chill returning. But Daenerys insisted, as did Robb. The Blackfish remained at Winterfell, along with Catelyn. Her old bones wanted no part of the bitter cold that lay beyond the last hearth. Manderly also stayed behind, preferring the comfort of a warm seat and a full table. Instead, a handful of experienced riders, plus Grey Worm and Ser Jorah, accompanied the Queen and Robb. They took several pack horses laden with supplies. They set out before dawn, the sky a leaden gray overhead. The wind cut sharply as they rode, but the roads were well maintained up to the last hearth, where the Umbers greeted them with hearty respect. From there, the party continued into wilder territory, the forests growing sparse, the land stark. Occasionally they glimpsed a stray traveler, or a group of free folk heading south, carrying furs and meager possessions. The free folk recognized Daenerys' sigil, but it was Robb's presence, as a Stark, that made them approach. They asked for safe passage. Robb told them to keep moving south if they wished, that no one would hinder them, so long as they caused no trouble. By the 4th day of travel, the air was bitterly cold, enough that Daenerys' cheeks turned a bright pink, and her breath came in clouds of white. Still, she pressed on, shoulders squared. At last, they crested a rise and saw the wall in the distance, a colossal barrier of ice, shimmering faintly under the bleak sun. It still inspired awe, even after all the years Robb had known of it. The scars from the final battle were visible near the base, where part of the ancient structure had cracked, only to be refrozen by the bitter winds. They approached Castle Black. The Black brothers on the ramparts sounded a horn, the noise echoing across the frosty wastes. The gates opened, revealing a courtyard that bustled with new recruits, men from all over the realm who had come to serve or been sent as penance for crimes. Some of them stared wide-eyed at the sight of Daenerys Targaryen with her braided silver hair, and at Robb Stark leading the column. A few recognized him instantly, saluting. "Your Grace," they called, or "the young wolf." The combination of their presence caused a stir. Descending from the steps came Jon Snow, dressed in the all-black leathers of the Watch, a thick cloak lined with fur. His dark hair was cropped shorter than Robb remembered, his face leaner, and his eyes carried the weight of command. He strode forward, a mixture of disbelief and quiet joy on his face. "Robb," he said, voice trembling slightly. Robb swung down from his horse and embraced Jon, clapping him on the back. The last time they had been together was in the chaos after the final battle. Then they had parted to tend their separate duties, uncertain if they would see each other soon. Now, as they stood in Castle Black's courtyard, Robb felt a surge of familial warmth. "Jon," he said softly, "you look good for a man braving these endless winters." Jon managed a wry smile. "When you have the wall at your back, you adapt quickly." He pulled away, turning to Daenerys. He bowed low, though it felt slightly awkward. "Your Grace. Welcome to Castle Black." "Merci." Daenerys regarded him with a thoughtful expression, a faint smile touching her lips. "Lord Commander Snow. It's good to see you well. You haven't changed a bit, perhaps just a little older in the eyes." His smile flickered. "Too many nights fighting whites will do that." He straightened, glancing at Grey Worm and Ser Jorah behind her. "Come inside. The halls are cramped, but there's warmth and food." They went in, stable hands tending their horses, while the Black brothers formed a curious crowd at a respectful distance. Within the common hall, a modest fire crackled. The space was far smaller than Winterfell's great hall, but it served. They sat around a rough-hewn table, with bowls of hot stew ladled out. Jon explained the current state of the Night's Watch, how recruits trickled in, how they patrolled the still-frozen expanses north of the wall, searching for any sign that might hint of a remaining threat. So far, all they'd encountered were the scattered bones of whites that the sun and time had worn away. Daenerys asked many questions, listening intently. "What do you need most, Lord Commander?" "More men? More supplies? I've no wish to leave the Watch lacking." Jon considered. "Men, yes. But we'll take whoever truly wants to serve, or has nowhere else to go. Supplies of grain and metals for forging would help. We're short on decent steel to arm the patrols, and building materials, wood, stone, even straw for bedding. The Watch is growing, but we're struggling to house the newcomers." Robb frowned. "We can send shipments from Winterfell. Perhaps the Queen can help coordinate deliveries from the southern kingdoms as well." Daenerys nodded. "I'll see to it. If we can unify some of the shipping routes around Eastwatch, it might speed up supply lines." No. Jon relaxed slightly. "That would help. Thank you." He paused, glancing at Robb. "You look well, brother. The last time I saw you, you had blood all down your side and eyes half dead from exhaustion. I'm glad the realm's treating you better now." Robb winced at the memory. "We won, Jon, but it cost us so much. I still feel it every day." Silence settled, heavy with the memories of that bleak war. Then Daenerys changed the subject. "Lord Commander, if you wish to show us around, I'd be grateful. I haven't had a chance to see the wall from the top. The last time I was here, it was all chaos and fighting." So Jon led them through the winding corridors, up a series of wooden steps to the top of the wall. The wind bit at their cheeks, keening across the endless ice. Daenerys' cloak snapped behind her. Robb felt an old chill in his bones. From this vantage, They could see the vast plain stretching into the true north, dotted with skeletal trees. Far off, mountains loomed, gray shapes in the haze. Jon stood near the edge, looking out, his gloved hands on the icy rampart. "Sometimes, I imagine I see movement out there," he murmured. "Shadows, but we've scouted far and wide. Whatever was out there is gone, or sleeping, or retreated into deeper darkness. Still, we keep watch." Robb joined him, resting a hand on the ice. "The realms of men endure because of that watch. And your leadership, Jon." He shrugged. "I'm only one man, though I do my best." Daenerys came to stand beside them. The wind whipped her silver hair across her face, so she brushed it back impatiently. "All of us do what we can. The living won, but let's never forget how close we came to losing." "No train." They stood there a while, letting the cold remind them of the war's cost and the fragility of peace. That night, Jon insisted they stay in Castle Black, offering them the modest guest quarters. The conversation continued, flowing easily between them. They spoke of the future of the Watch, the alliances in the south, and the personal burdens they each bore. Jon was especially concerned about the free folk, who were trying to settle in the Gift. He worried about tensions with northern lords who might resent their presence. Robb promised to help smooth over any disputes. In the midst of these serious topics, Daenerys occasionally teased Jon in a gentle way, calling him the bastard of Winterfell as a jest, which he took with good humor. She also teased Robb about his stoic manner, remarking that she'd love to see him laugh more. He managed a small chuckle. It had been a long time since he laughed freely. Sometimes, his old sense of humor felt like a casualty of the Red Wedding. Still, in the warmth of that dimly lit hall, among comrades who had fought and bled for each other, he felt a momentary ease. Before they retired for the night, Daenerys expressed a desire to fly a dragon over the wall at dawn, just to survey the land. Jon looked uneasy, as the Watch had never been visited by a dragon except during the war, but he did not forbid it. "Just don't stray too far into the lands beyond. We can't guarantee your safety from wild beasts or hidden dangers." At daybreak, the watchers on the wall witnessed a sight seldom seen: Daenerys Targaryen mounting Regal, the green-hued dragon, while in the courtyard below, men gaped in awe. Robb, Jon, and a handful of black brothers observed from the ramparts. With a mighty beat of wings, Regal ascended, carrying the queen skyward. The rush of wind nearly knocked a few watchers over. Then the dragon soared over the wall, a solitary silhouette against the pale dawn sky. For a time, Robb and Jon stood together, scanning the horizon. They couldn't see Daenerys clearly once she dipped over the far side. A hush settled over Castle Black, as though everyone held their breath. Eventually, they glimpsed the dragon reappearing, circling around. When Daenerys landed in the courtyard again, her cheeks were flushed with cold, and her eyes shone with exhilaration. "It's vast," she said, dismounting as men hurried forward to secure Regal. "There's a strange beauty to it, but also a silent menace. I saw no living souls, only ice and rock. And bones. There seemed to be a scattering of old remains, possibly from the war. The wind has blown them far." Jon nodded. "We'll send a patrol to bury or burn what we can. Some nights, the wind howls, as if the ghosts of the others are crying out." Daenerys looked thoughtful. "I wonder if in 1,000 years, men will still speak of this war as a half-legend, never truly believing how close the darkness came." Robb said softly, "It's the duty of those who live to remember, so that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated." She met his gaze, giving a solemn nod. "Well spoken." They spent one more night at Castle Black. Jon and Robb stayed up late, talking quietly by the fire in Jon's cramped chamber. Jon asked about Arya, Sansa, and the scattered pieces of their family. Robb recounted the latest news about Sansa's possible location, and their efforts to find her. They shared an unspoken regret that they had parted from their sisters in times of chaos. But there was hope. Perhaps if the gods were kind, the Starks would be reunited. Jon confessed to missing them all, yet he remained bound by his vows to the Watch. If I break those vows to see my family, he said heavily, what honor remains? Robb shook his head. Our father would have understood. But I see how you feel. Your presence here matters, not just for the realm, but for the memory of the living. I won't ask you to break your oath. Madame Sire. They parted in the early hours, both tired but comforted by each other's company. At dawn, Daenerys announced she would return to Winterfell with the group, then begin her journey south again. Jon saw them off, exchanging a firm embrace with Robb and a respectful bow to the Queen. The party rode out, a sense of accomplishment mingling with the chill air. The journey back was swift. Though the cold bit at them, the roads were clear enough. They stopped once more at the last hearth, where the Umbers loaded them with provisions for the ride. Daenerys found the Umbers a curious lot, loud, boisterous, full of gallows humor. She accepted their hospitality with grace, though her retinue seemed overwhelmed by the outpouring of strong ale and hearty laughter. At last, they arrived once more at Winterfell's gates. The courtyard was abuzz with activity. Servants greeted them, and the watchers on the walls cheered. Robb felt a twinge of relief at being home, but also a pang of restlessness. So many concerns still tugged at him. Sansa's search, the Ironborn, the swirl of southern politics. He wanted to check in with his mother and the Blackfish at once, to see if any new letters had arrived. As they dismounted, Catelyn hurried out to meet them. Her eyes shone with excitement. She gripped Robb's arm. "My son, there's news. Sansa has been found." His heart leapt. "Where?" "In the Riverlands," Catelyn gasped, nearly breathless. "Near the Trident." She was traveling in disguise with a few companions. Some riders from House Mallister recognized her. They sent word to River Run. "She's on her way here under escort, safe and well." Robb felt a rush of relief that made his knees threaten to buckle. He glanced at Daenerys, who had dismounted and overheard. A smile spread across her face. "That's wonderful news," she said warmly. Catelyn nodded fervently. "I can hardly believe it. After all this time, Sansa is coming home. She should arrive within the fortnight." Robb hugged his mother fiercely, feeling the weight of so many years slide off his shoulders. Then he looked at Daenerys, who watched them with quiet approval. "Your Grace," he said, voice thick with emotion, "thank you for your help. Your lords in the Vale must have passed word as well." She inclined her head. "I'm glad to have played a part. This is your family's joy. Relish it." His thoughts spun. If Sansa was returning, he could ask her about Arya, about everything that had happened in King's Landing, in the Vale, under Baelish's manipulations. He could try to piece together the broken tapestry of House Stark. Even as a swirl of responsibilities tugged at him, the simple joy of welcoming his sister home after so long overshadowed everything. He turned to Daenerys. "Will you stay to greet her?" "She would be honored to meet the Queen who helped save our home. If you can spare a few more days." Daenerys considered. "I had planned to start south tomorrow, but this is a moment of import for House Stark. And the Targaryens and Starks are allies, are we not? Very well. I'll remain until she arrives." Robb smiled, genuine warmth in it. "You have our gratitude, both as queen and as a friend." In that instant, under the gray northern sky, Robb felt something shift. The gratitude and camaraderie between him and Daenerys was real. They had been allies on the battlefield, co-rulers in the realm's reconstruction. But perhaps this was the first time they had stood side by side in a purely joyful moment. He wondered if such a bond might deepen. He wondered if old wounds could ever truly heal. They walked together into Winterfell's hall, the bustle of preparations swirling around them, men and women calling out the good news about Sansa Stark. The future was uncertain, but for the moment, hope blossomed in the heart of the North, and the promise of reunion, of a family scattered by war, slowly coming back together, lifted every spirit. Robb stood among them, a weary king shaped by betrayal and war, the scar on his side reminding him of how close he had come to death, and the memory of Grey Wind forever haunting him. Yet now, at least for a time, the corridors of Winterfell thrummed with the heartbeat of renewal. Daenerys Targaryen, the queen who had once freed slaves across the sea, had become a catalyst for a new age in Westeros. The direwolf and the dragon had joined forces. And though countless challenges remained, they had proven that unity could triumph over the darkest threats. If the old gods and the new were kind, that unity would endure, and the North, indeed, all of Westeros, would have a chance to thrive in the days to come.